Chapter 31. With steps more faltering and unsteady than those with which she had approached the room, the child withdrew from the door and groped her way back to her own chamber. The terror she had lately felt was nothing compared with that which now oppressed her. No strange robber, no treacherous host conniving at the plunder of his guests, or stealing to their beds to kill them in their sleep. No nightly prowler, however terrible and cruel, could have awakened in her bosom half the dread which the recognition of her silent visitor inspired. The gray-headed old man gliding like a ghost into her room and acting the thief while he supposed her fast asleep, then bearing off his prize and hanging over it with the ghastly exultation she had witnessed, was worse, immeasurably worse, and far more dreadful, for the moment, to reflect upon, than anything her wildest fancy could have suggested. If he should return, there was no lock or bolt upon the door, and if, distrustful of having left some money yet behind, he should come back to seek for more, a vague awe and horror surrounded the idea of his slinking in again with stealthy tread and turning his face toward the empty bed, while she shrank down close at his feet to avoid his touch, which was almost insupportable. She sat and listened. Hark! A footstep on the stairs, and now the door was slowly opening. It was but imagination, yet imagination had all the terrors of reality. Nay, it was worse, for the reality would have come and gone, and there an end. But in imagination it was always coming, and never went away. The feeling which beset the child was one of dim, uncertain horror. She had no fear of the dear old grandfather, in whose love for her this disease of the brain had been engendered. But the man she had seen that night, wrapped in the game of chance, lurking in her room and counting the money by the glimmering light, seemed like another creature in his shape, a monstrous distortion of his image, a something to recoil from and be the more afraid of because it bore a likeness to him and kept close about her, as he did. She could scarcely connect her own affectionate companion, save by his loss, with this old man, so like yet so unlike him. She had wept to see him dull and quiet. How much greater cause she had for weeping now. The child sat watching and thinking of these things, until the phantom in her mind so increased in gloom and terror that she felt it would be a relief to hear the old man's voice, or, if he were asleep, even to see him, and banish some of the fears that clustered round his image. She stole down the stairs and passage again. The door was still ajar as she had left it, and the candle burning as before. She had her own candle in her hand, prepared to say, if he were waking, that she was uneasy and could not rest, and had come to see if his were still alight. Looking into the room, she saw him lying calmly on his bed, and so took courage to enter. Fast asleep, no passion in the face, no avarice, no anxiety, no wild desire. All gentle, tranquil, and at peace. This was not the gambler or the shadow in her room. This was not even the worn and jaded man whose face had so often met her own in the gray morning light. This was her dear old friend, her harmless fellow-traveler, her good, kind grandfather. She had no fear as she looked upon his slumbering features, but she had a deep and weighty sorrow, and it found its relief in tears. "God bless him," said the child, stooping softly to kiss his placid cheek. "I see too well now that they would indeed part us if they found us out, and shut him up from the light of the sun and sky. He has only me to help him. God bless us both." Lighting her candle, she retreated as silently as she had come, and gaining her own room once more, sat up during the remainder of that long, miserable night. At last the day turned her waning candle pale, and she fell asleep. She was quickly roused by the girl who had shown her up to bed, and, as soon as she was dressed, prepared to go down to her grandfather. But first she searched her pocket and found that her money was all gone. Not a sixpence remained. The old man was ready, and in a few seconds they were on their road. The child thought he rather avoided her eye, and appeared to expect that she would tell him of her loss. She felt she must do that, or he might suspect the truth. "Grandfather," she said in a tremulous voice, after they had walked about a mile in silence, "do you think they are honest people at the house yonder?" Why? Returned the old man, trembling. Do I think them honest? Yes, they played honestly. I'll tell you why I ask, rejoined Nell. I lost some money last night, out of my bedroom, I am sure. Unless it was taken by somebody in jest, only in jest, dear grandfather, which would make me laugh heartily if I could but know it. Who would take money in jest? Returned the old man in a hurried manner. Those who take money, take it to keep. Don't talk of jest. Then it was stolen out of my room, dear, said the child, whose last hope was destroyed by the manner of this reply. But is there no more, Nell? Said the old man. No more anywhere? Was it all taken? Every farthing of it? Was there nothing left? Nothing, replied the child. We must get more, said the old man. We must earn it, Nell. Hoard it up, scrape it together, come by it somehow. Never mind this loss. Tell nobody of it, and perhaps we may regain it. Don't ask how. We may regain it and a great deal more. But tell nobody, or trouble may come of it. And so they took it out of thy room, when thou wert asleep, he added in a compassionate tone, very different from the secret, cunning way in which he had spoken until now. Poor Nell, poor little Nell. The child hung down her head and wept. The sympathizing tone in which he spoke was quite sincere. She was sure of that. It was not the lightest part of her sorrow to know that this was done for her. Not a word about it to anyone but me, said the old man. No, not even to me, he added hastily, for it can do no good. All the losses that ever were are not worth tears from thy eyes, darling. Why should they be, when we will win them back? Let them go, said the child, looking up. Let them go, once and forever, and I would never shed another tear if every penny had been 1,000 pounds. Well, well, returned the old man, checking himself as some impetuous answer rose to his lips. She knows no better. I ought to be thankful of it. But listen to me, said the child earnestly. Will you listen to me? I'll listen, returned the old man, still without looking at her. A pretty voice. It has always a sweet sound to me. It always had when it was her mother's, poor child. Let me persuade you then. Oh, do let me persuade you, said the child, to think no more of gains or losses, and to try no fortune but the fortune we pursue together. We pursue this aim together, retorted her grandfather, still looking away and seeming to confer with himself. Whose image sanctifies the game? Have we been worse off, resumed the child, since you forgot these cares, and we have been traveling on together? Have we not been much better and happier without a home to shelter us than ever we were in that unhappy house, when they were on your mind? She speaks the truth, murmured the old man in the same tone as before. It must not turn me, but it is the truth. No doubt it is. Only remember what we have been since that bright morning when we turned our backs upon it for the last time, said Nell. Only remember what we have been since we have been free of all those miseries. What peaceful days and quiet nights we have had. What pleasant times we have known. What happiness we have enjoyed. If we have been tired or hungry, we have been soon refreshed and slept the sounder for it. Think what beautiful things we have seen, and how contented we have felt. And why was this blessed change? He stopped her with a motion of his hand, and bade her talk to him no more just then, for he was busy. After a time he kissed her cheek, still motioning her to silence, and walked on, looking far before him, and sometimes stopping and gazing with a puckered brow upon the ground, as if he were painfully trying to collect his disordered thoughts. Once she saw tears in his eyes. When he had gone on thus for some time, he took her hand in his as he was accustomed to do, with nothing of the violence or animation of his late manner. And so, by degrees so fine that the child could not trace them, he settled down into his usual quiet way, and suffered her to lead him where she would. When they presented themselves in the midst of the stupendous collection, they found, as Nell had anticipated, that Mrs. Jarley was not yet out of bed, and that, although she had suffered some uneasiness on their account overnight, and had indeed sat up for them until past 11 o'clock, she had retired in the persuasion that, being overtaken by storm at some distance from home, they had sought the nearest shelter and would not return before morning. Nell immediately applied herself with great assiduity to the decoration and preparation of the room, and had the satisfaction of completing her task and dressing herself neatly before the beloved of the royal family came down to breakfast. "We haven't had," said Mrs. Jarley when the meal was over, "more than 8 of Miss Monflathers's young ladies all the time we've been here, and there's 26 of 'em, as I was told by the cook when I asked her a question or two and put her on the free list. We must try 'em with a parcel of new bills, and you shall take it, my dear, and see what effect that has upon 'em." The proposed expedition being one of paramount importance, Mrs. Jarley adjusted Nell's bonnet with her own hands, and declaring that she certainly did look very pretty and reflected credit on the establishment, dismissed her with many commendations and certain needful directions as to the turnings on the right which she was to take, and the turnings on the left which she was to avoid. Thus instructed, Nell had no difficulty in finding out Miss Monflathers's boarding and day establishment, which was a large house, with a high wall, and a large garden gate with a large brass plate, and a small grating through which Miss Monflathers's parlour-maid inspected all visitors before admitting them. For nothing in the shape of a man, no, not even a milkman, was suffered, without special license, to pass that gate. Even the tax-gatherer, who was stout, and wore spectacles and a broad-brimmed hat, had the taxes handed through the grating. More obdurate than gate of adamant or brass, this gate of Miss Monflathers's frowned on all mankind. The very butcher respected it as a gate of mystery, and left off whistling when he rang the bell. As Nell approached the awful door, it turned slowly upon its hinges with a creaking noise, and, forth from the solemn grove beyond, came a long file of young ladies, 2 and 2, all with open books in their hands, and some with parasols likewise. And last of the goodly procession came Miss Monflathers, bearing herself a parasol of lilac silk, and supported by 2 smiling teachers, each mortally envious of the other, and devoted unto Miss Monflathers. Confused by the looks and whispers of the girls, Nell stood with downcast eyes and suffered the procession to pass on, until Miss Monflathers, bringing up the rear, approached her, when she curtsied and presented her little packet. On receipt whereof Miss Monflathers commanded that the line should halt. "You're the waxwork child, are you not?" said Miss Monflathers. "Yes, ma'am," replied Nell, coloring deeply, for the young ladies had collected about her, and she was the center on which all eyes were fixed. "And don't you think you must be a very wicked little child?" said Miss Monflathers, who was of rather uncertain temper, and lost no opportunity of impressing moral truths upon the tender minds of the young ladies, "to be a waxwork child at all?" Poor Nell had never viewed her position in this light, and not knowing what to say, remained silent, blushing more deeply than before. "Don't you know," said Miss Monflathers, "that it's very naughty and unfeminine, and a perversion of the properties wisely and benignantly transmitted to us, with expansive powers to be roused from their dormant state through the medium of cultivation?" The 2 teachers murmured their respectful approval of this home thrust, and looked at Nell as though they would have said that there indeed Miss Monflathers had hit her very hard. Then they smiled and glanced at Miss Monflathers, and then, their eyes meeting, they exchanged looks which plainly said that each considered herself smiler in ordinary to Miss Monflathers, and regarded the other as having no right to smile, and that her so doing was an act of presumption and impertinence. "Don't you feel how naughty it is of you," resumed Miss Monflathers, "to be a waxwork child, when you might have the proud consciousness of assisting, to the extent of your infant powers, the manufactures of your country, of improving your mind by the constant contemplation of the steam engine, and of earning a comfortable and independent subsistence of from 2 and 9pence to 3 shillings per week? Don't you know that the harder you are at work, the happier you are?" "How doth the little," murmured one of the teachers, in quotation from Dr. Watts. "Eh?" said Miss Monflathers, turning smartly round. "Who said that?" Of course the teacher who had not said it indicated the rival who had, whom Miss Monflathers frowningly requested to hold her peace, by that means throwing the informing teacher into raptures of joy. "The little busy bee," said Miss Monflathers, drawing herself up, "is applicable only to genteel children. In books, or work, or healthful play, is quite right as far as they are concerned, and the work means painting on velvet, fancy needlework, or embroidery. In such cases as these, pointing to Nell with her parasol, and in the case of all poor people's children, we should read it thus: in work, 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 in work alway. Let my first years be past, that I may give for every day some good account at last." A deep hum of applause rose not only from the two teachers, but from all the pupils, who were equally astonished to hear Miss Monflathers improvising after this brilliant style. For although she had been long known as a politician, she had never appeared before as an original poet. Just then somebody happened to discover that Nell was crying, and all eyes were again turned towards her. There were indeed tears in her eyes, and drawing out her handkerchief to brush them away, she happened to let it fall. Before she could stoop to pick it up, one young lady of about 15 or 16, who had been standing a little apart from the others, as though she had no recognized place among them, sprang forward and put it in her hand. She was gliding timidly away again, when she was arrested by the governess. "It was Miss Edwards who did that, I know," said Miss Monflathers predictively. "Now I am sure that was Miss Edwards." It was Miss Edwards, and everybody said it was Miss Edwards, and Miss Edwards herself admitted that it was. "Is it not," said Miss Monflathers, putting down her parasol to take a severer view of the offender, "a most remarkable thing, Miss Edwards, that you have an attachment to the lower classes which always draws you to their sides? Or rather, is it not a most extraordinary thing that all I say and do will not wean you from propensities which your original station in life have unhappily rendered habitual to you, you extremely vulgar-minded girl?" "I really intended no harm, ma'am," said a sweet voice. "It was a momentary impulse, indeed." "An impulse," repeated Miss Monflathers scornfully. "I wonder that you presume to speak of impulses to me." Both the teachers assented. "I am astonished." Both the teachers were astonished. "I suppose it is an impulse which induces you to take the part of every groveling and debased person that comes in your way." Both the teachers supposed so too. "But I would have you know, Miss Edwards," resumed the governess in a tone of increased severity, "that you cannot be permitted, if it be only for the sake of preserving a proper example and decorum in this establishment, that you cannot be permitted, and that you shall not be permitted, to fly in the face of your superiors in this exceedingly gross manner. If you have no reason to feel a becoming pride before waxwork children, there are young ladies here who have, and you must either defer to those young ladies or leave the establishment, Miss Edwards." This young lady, being motherless and poor, was apprenticed at the school, taught for nothing, teaching others what she learnt for nothing, boarded for nothing, lodged for nothing, and set down and rated as something immeasurably less than nothing by all the dwellers in the house. The servant maids felt her inferiority, for they were better treated, free to come and go, and regarded in their stations with much more respect. The teachers were infinitely superior, for they had paid to go to school in their time, and were paid now. The pupils cared little for a companion who had no grand stories to tell about home, no friends to come with post-horses, and be received in all humility, with cake and wine, by the governess. No deferential servant to attend and bear her home for the holidays. Nothing genteel to talk about, and nothing to display. But why was Miss Monflathers always vexed and irritated with the poor apprentice? How did that come to pass? Why, the gayest feather in Miss Monflathers's cap, and the brightest glory of Miss Monflathers's school, was a baronet's daughter, the real live daughter of a real live baronet, who, by some extraordinary reversal of the laws of nature, was not only plain in features but dull in intellect, while the poor apprentice had both a ready wit and a handsome face and figure. It seems incredible. Here was Miss Edwards, who only paid a small premium which had been spent long ago, every day outshining and excelling the baronet's daughter, who learned all the extras, or was taught them all. and whose half-yearly bill came to double that of any other young ladies in the school, making no account of the honor and reputation of her pupillage. Therefore, and because she was a dependent, Miss Monflathers had a great dislike to Miss Edwards, and was spiteful to her, and aggravated by her, and when she had compassion on little Nell, verbally fell upon and maltreated her as we have already seen. "You will not take the air today, Miss Edwards," said Miss Monflathers. "Have the goodness to retire to your own room, and not to leave it without permission." The poor girl was moving hastily away, when she was suddenly, in nautical phrase, brought to by a subdued shriek from Miss Monflathers. "She has passed me without any salute," cried the governess, raising her eyes to the sky. "She has actually passed me without the slightest acknowledgment of my presence." The young lady turned and curtsied. Nell could see that she raised her dark eyes to the face of her superior, and that their expression, and that of her whole attitude for the instant, was one of mute but most touching appeal against this ungenerous usage. Miss Monflathers only tossed her head in reply, and the great gate closed upon a bursting heart. "As for you, you wicked child," said Miss Monflathers, turning to Nell, "tell your mistress that if she presumes to take the liberty of sending to me any more, I will write to the legislative authorities and have her put in the stocks, or compelled to do penance in a white sheet. And you may depend upon it that you shall certainly experience the treadmill if you dare to come here again. Now, ladies, on." The procession filed off, 2 and 2, with the books and parasols, and Miss Monflathers, calling the baronet's daughter to walk with her and smooth her ruffled feelings, discarded the two teachers, who by this time had exchanged their smiles for looks of sympathy, and left them to bring up the rear and hate each other a little more for being obliged to walk together. Chapter 32. Mrs. Jarley's wrath on first learning that she had been threatened with the indignity of stocks and penance passed all description. The genuine and only Jarley exposed to public scorn, jeered by children, and flouted by beadles. The delight of the nobility and gentry shorn of a bonnet which a lady mayoress might have sighed to wear, and arrayed in a white sheet as a spectacle of mortification and humility. And Miss Monflathers, the audacious creature who presumed, even in the dimmest and remotest distance of her imagination, to conjure up the degrading picture, "I am most inclined," said Mrs. Jarley, bursting with the fullness of her anger and the weakness of her means of revenge, "to turn atheist when I think of it." But instead of adopting this course of retaliation, Mrs. Jarley, on second thoughts, brought out the suspicious bottle, and ordering glasses to be set forth upon her favorite drum, and sinking into a chair behind it, called her satellites about her, and to them several times recounted, word for word, the affronts she had received. This done, she begged them in a kind of deep despair to drink, then laughed, then cried, then took a little sip herself, then laughed and cried again, and took a little more. And so, by degrees, the worthy lady went on, increasing in smiles and decreasing in tears, until at last she could not laugh enough at Miss Monflathers, who, from being an object of dire vexation, became one of sheer ridicule and absurdity. "For which of us is best off, I wonder," quoth Mrs. Jarley, "she or me? It's only talking, when all is said and done, and if she talks of me in the stocks, why I can talk of her in the stocks, which is a good deal funnier if we come to that. Lord, what does it matter, after all?" Having arrived at this comfortable frame of mind, to which she had been greatly assisted by certain short interjectional remarks of the philosophical George, Mrs. Jarley consoled Nell with many kind words, and requested as a personal favor that whenever she thought of Miss Monflathers, she would do nothing else but laugh at her all the days of her life. So ended Mrs. Jarley's wrath, which subsided long before the going down of the sun. Nell's anxieties, however, were of a deeper kind, and the checks they imposed upon her cheerfulness were not so easily removed. That evening, as she had dreaded, her grandfather stole away, and did not come back until the night was far spent. Worn out as she was, and fatigued in mind and body, she sat up alone, counting the minutes, until he returned, penniless, broken-spirited, and wretched, but still hotly bent upon his infatuation. "Get me money," he said wildly, as they parted for the night. "I must have money, Nell. It shall be paid thee back with gallant interest one day, but all the money that comes into thy hands must be mine, not for myself, but to use for thee. Remember, Nell, to use for thee." What could the child do with the knowledge she had, but give him every penny that came into her hands, lest he should be tempted on to rob their benefactress? If she told the truth, so thought the child, he would be treated as a madman. If she did not supply him with money, he would supply himself. Supplying him, she fed the fire that burnt him up and put him perhaps beyond recovery. Distracted by these thoughts, borne down by the weight of the sorrow which she dared not tell, tortured by a crowd of apprehensions whenever the old man was absent, and dreading alike his stay and his return, the color forsook her cheek, her eye grew dim, and her heart was oppressed and heavy. All her old sorrows had come back upon her, augmented by new fears and doubts. By day they were ever present to her mind. By night they hovered round her pillow and haunted her in dreams. It was natural that, in the midst of her affliction, she should often revert to that sweet young lady of whom she had only caught a hasty glance, but whose sympathy, expressed in one slight brief action, dwelt in her memory like the kindnesses of years. She would often think, if she had such a friend as that to whom to tell her griefs, how much lighter her heart would be, that if she were but free to hear that voice, she would be happier. Then she would wish that she were something better, that she were not quite so poor and humble, that she dared address her without fearing a repulse, and then feel that there was an immeasurable distance between them, and have no hope that the young lady thought of her any more. It was now holiday time at the schools, and the young ladies had gone home, and Miss Monflathers was reported to be flourishing in London and damaging the hearts of middle-aged gentlemen, but nobody said anything about Miss Edwards, whether she had gone home, or whether she had any home to go to, whether she was still at the school, or anything about her. But one evening, as Nell was returning from a lonely walk, she happened to pass the inn where the stage-coaches stopped, just as one drove up, and there was the beautiful girl she so well remembered, pressing forward to embrace a young child whom they were helping down from the roof. Well, this was her sister, her little sister, much younger than Nell, whom she had not seen. So the story went afterwards, for 5 years, and to bring whom to that place on a short visit, she had been saving her poor means all that time. Nell felt as if her heart would break when she saw them meet. They went a little apart from the knot of people who had congregated about the coach, and fell upon each other's neck, and sobbed, and wept with joy. Their plain and simple dress, the distance which the child had come alone, their agitation and delight, and the tears they shed, would have told their history by themselves. They became a little more composed in a short time, and went away, not so much hand in hand as clinging to each other. "Are you sure you're happy, sister?" said the child as they passed where Nell was standing. "Quite happy now," she answered. "But always," said the child. "Ah, sister, why do you turn away your face?" Nell could not help following at a little distance. They went to the house of an old nurse, where the elder sister had engaged a bedroom for the child. "I shall come to you early every morning," she said, "and we can be together all the day. Why not at night time too? Dear sister, would they be angry with you for that?" Why were the eyes of little Nell wet, that night, with tears like those of the two sisters? Why did she bear a grateful heart because they had met, and feel it pain to think that they would shortly part? Let us not believe that any selfish reference, unconscious though it might have been, to her own trials awoke this sympathy, but thank God that the innocent joys of others can strongly move us, and that we, even in our fallen nature, have one source of pure emotion which must be prized in heaven, by morning's cheerful glow, but oftener still by evening's gentle light. The child, with a respect for the short and happy intercourse of these two sisters which forbade her to approach and say a thankful word, although she yearned to do so, followed them at a distance in their walks and rambles, stopping when they stopped, sitting on the grass when they sat down, rising when they went on, and feeling it a companionship and delight to be so near them. Their evening walk was by a river's side. Here, every night, The child was too, unseen by them, unthought of, unregarded, but feeling as if they were her friends, as if they had confidences and trusts together, as if her load were lightened and less hard to bear, as if they mingled their sorrows and found mutual consolation. It was a weak fancy, perhaps, the childish fancy of a young and lonely creature. But night after night, and still the sisters loitered in the same place, and still the child followed with a mild and softened heart. She was much startled, on returning home one night, to find that Mrs. Jarley had commanded an announcement to be prepared, to the effect that the stupendous collection would only remain in its present quarters one day longer, in fulfillment of which threat, for all announcements connected with public amusements are well known to be irrevocable and most exact, the stupendous collection shut up next day. "Are we going from this place directly, ma'am?" said Nell. "Look here, child," returned Mrs. Jarley. "That'll inform you." And so saying, Mrs. Jarley produced another announcement, wherein it was stated that, in consequence of numerous inquiries at the waxwork door, and in consequence of crowds having been disappointed in obtaining admission, the exhibition would be continued for 1 week longer, and would reopen next day. "For now that the schools are gone, and the regular sightseers exhausted," said Mrs. Jarley, "we come to the general public, and they want stimulating." Upon the following day at noon, Mrs. Jarley established herself behind the highly ornamented table, attended by the distinguished effigies before mentioned, and ordered the doors to be thrown open for the readmission of a discerning and enlightened public. But the first day's operations were by no means of a successful character, inasmuch as the general public, though they manifested a lively interest in Mrs. Jarley personally, and such of her waxen satellites as were to be seen for nothing, were not affected by any impulses moving them to the payment of 6 pence a head. Thus, notwithstanding that a great many people continued to stare at the entry and the figures therein displayed, and remained there with great perseverance, by the hour at a time, to hear the barrel organ played and to read the bills, and notwithstanding that they were kind enough to recommend their friends to patronize the exhibition in the like manner, until the doorway was regularly blockaded by half the population of the town, who, when they went off duty, were relieved by the other half. It was not found that the treasury was any the richer, or that the prospects of the establishment were at all encouraging. In this depressed state of the classical market, Mrs. Jarley made extraordinary efforts to stimulate the popular taste and whet the popular curiosity. Certain machinery in the body of the nun on the leads over the door was cleaned up and put in motion, so that the figure shook its head paralytically all day long, to the great admiration of a drunken, but very Protestant, barber over the way, who looked upon the said paralytic motion as typical of the degrading effect wrought upon the human mind by the ceremonies of the Romish Church, and discoursed upon that theme with great eloquence and morality. The two carters constantly passed in and out of the exhibition room, under various disguises, protesting aloud that the sight was better worth the money than anything they had beheld in all their lives, and urging the bystanders, with tears in their eyes, not to neglect such a brilliant gratification. Mrs. Jarley sat in the pay-place, chinking silver moneys from noon till night, and solemnly calling upon the crowd to take notice that the price of admission was only 6 pence, and that the departure of the whole collection, on a short tour among the crowned heads of Europe, was positively fixed for that day week. "So be in time, be in time, be in time," said Mrs. Jarley at the close of every such address. "Remember that this is Jarley's stupendous collection of upwards of 100 figures, and that it is the only collection in the world, all others being impostors and deceptions. Be in time, be in time, be in time." Chapter 33. As the course of this tale requires that we should become acquainted, somewhere hereabouts, with a few particulars connected with the domestic economy of Mr. Sampson Brass, and as a more convenient place than the present is not likely to occur for that purpose, the historian takes the friendly reader by the hand, and springing with him into the air, and cleaving the same at a greater rate than ever Don Cleophas Leandro Perez Zambullo and his familiar traveled through that pleasant region in company, alights with him upon the pavement of Bevis Marks. The intrepid aeronauts alight before a small dark house, once the residence of Mr. Sampson Brass. In the parlor window of this little habitation, which is so close upon the footway that the passenger who takes the wall brushes the dim glass with his coat sleeve, much to its improvement, for it is very dirty. In this parlor window in the days of its occupation by Sampson Brass, there hung, all awry and slack and discolored by the sun, a curtain of faded green, so threadbare from long service as by no means to intercept the view of the little dark room, but rather to afford a favorable medium through which to observe it accurately. There was not much to look at. A rickety table with spare bundles of papers, yellow and ragged from long carriage in the pocket, ostentatiously displayed upon its top. A couple of stools set face to face on opposite sides of this crazy piece of furniture. A treacherous old chair by the fireplace, whose withered arms had hugged full many a client and helped to squeeze him dry. A second-hand wig box, used as a depository for blank writs and declarations and other small forms of law, once the sole contents of the head which belonged to the wig which belonged to the box, as they were now of the box itself, 2 or 3 common books of practice, a jar of ink, a pounce box, a stunted hearth broom, a carpet trodden to shreds but still clinging with the tightness of desperation to its tacks. These, with the yellow wainscot of the walls, the smoke-discolored ceiling, the dust and cobwebs, were among the most prominent decorations of the office of Mr. Sampson Brass. But this was mere still life, of no greater importance than the plate, Brass, solicitor, upon the door, and the bill, first floor to let to a single gentleman, which was tied to the knocker. The office commonly held 2 examples of animated nature, more to the purpose of this history, and in whom it has a stronger interest and more particular concern. Of these, one was Mr. Brass himself, who has already appeared in these pages. The other was his clerk, assistant, housekeeper, secretary, confidential plotter, adviser, intriguer, and bill of cost increaser, Miss Brass, a kind of Amazon at common law, of whom it may be desirable to offer a brief description. Miss Sally Brass, then, was a lady of 35 or thereabouts, of a gaunt and bony figure and a resolute bearing, which if it repressed the softer emotions of love and kept admirers at a distance, certainly inspired a feeling akin to awe in the breasts of those male strangers who had the happiness to approach her. In face she bore a striking resemblance to her brother, Sampson. So exact, indeed, was the likeness between them, that had it consorted with Miss Brass's maiden modesty and gentle womanhood to have assumed her brother's clothes in a frolic and sat down beside him, it would have been difficult for the oldest friend of the family to determine which was Sampson and which Sally, especially as the lady carried upon her upper lip certain reddish demonstrations, which, if the imagination had been assisted by her attire, might have been mistaken for a beard. These were, however, in all probability, nothing more than eyelashes in a wrong place, as the eyes of Miss Brass were quite free from any such natural impertinencies. In complexion Miss Brass was sallow, rather a dirty sallow, so to speak, but this hue was agreeably relieved by the healthy glow which mantled in the extreme tip of her laughing nose. Her voice was exceedingly impressive, deep and rich in quality, and once heard, not easily forgotten. Her usual dress was a green gown, in color not unlike the curtain of the office window, made tight to the figure and terminating at the throat, where it was fastened behind by a peculiarly large and massive button. Feeling, no doubt, that simplicity and plainness are the soul of elegance, Miss Brass wore no collar or kerchief except upon her head, which was invariably ornamented with a brown gauze scarf, like the wing of the fabled vampire, and which, twisted into any form that happened to suggest itself, formed an easy and graceful headdress. Such was Miss Brass in person. In mind, she was of a strong and vigorous turn, having from her earliest youth devoted herself with uncommon ardor to the study of law, not wasting her speculations upon its eagle flights, which are rare, but tracing it attentively through all the slippery and eel-like crawlings in which it commonly pursues its way. Nor had she, like many persons of great intellect, confined herself to theory or stopped short where practical usefulness begins. Inasmuch as she could engross, fair copy, fill up printed forms with perfect accuracy, and in short, transact any ordinary duty of the office down to pouncing a skin of parchment or mending a pen. It is difficult to understand how, possessed of these combined attractions, she should remain Miss Brass. But whether she had steeled her heart against mankind, or whether those who might have wooed and won her were deterred by fears that, being learned in the law, she might have too near her fingers' ends those particular statutes which regulate what are familiarly termed actions for breach, certain it is that she was still in a state of celibacy, and still in daily occupation of her old stool opposite to that of her brother Samson. And equally certain it is, by the way, that between these two stools a great many people had come to the ground. One morning Mr. Samson Brass sat upon his stool copying some legal process, and viciously digging his pen deep into the paper, as if he were writing upon the very heart of the party against whom it was directed. And Miss Sally Brass sat upon her stool making a new pen preparatory to drawing out a little bill, which was her favorite occupation. And so they sat in silence for a long time, until Miss Brass broke silence. "Have you nearly done, Sammy?" said Miss Brass. For in her mild and feminine lips, Samson became Sammy, and all things were softened down. "No," returned her brother. "It would have been all done, though, if you had helped at the right time." "Oh, yes, indeed," cried Miss Sally. "You want my help, don't you? You, too, that are going to keep a clerk." "Am I going to keep a clerk for my own pleasure, or because of my own wish, you provoking rascal?" said Mr. Brass, putting his pen in his mouth and grinning spitefully at his sister. "What do you taunt me about going to keep a clerk for?" It may be observed in this place, lest the fact of Mr. Brass calling a lady a rascal should occasion any wonderment or surprise, that he was so habituated to having her near him in a man's capacity that he had gradually accustomed himself to talk to her as though she were really a man. And this feeling was so perfectly reciprocal that not only did Mr. Brass often call Miss Brass a rascal, or even put an adjective before the rascal, but Miss Brass looked upon it as quite a matter of course, and was as little moved as any other lady would be by being called an angel. "What do you taunt me, after 3 hours' talk last night, with going to keep a clerk for?" repeated Mr. Brass, grinning again with the pen in his mouth, like some nobleman's or gentleman's crest. "Is it my fault?" "All I know is," said Miss Sally, smiling drily, for she delighted in nothing so much as irritating her brother, "that if every one of your clients is to force us to keep a clerk, whether we want to or not, you had better leave off business, strike yourself off the roll, and get taken in execution as soon as you can." "Have we got any other client like him?" said Brass. "Have we got another client like him now? Will you answer me that?" "Do you mean in the face?" said his sister. "Do I mean in the face?" sneered Samson Brass, reaching over to take up the bill book and fluttering its leaves rapidly. "Look here, Daniel Quilp, Esquire, Daniel Quilp, Esquire, Daniel Quilp, Esquire, all through. Whether should I take a clerk that he recommends, and says, 'This is the man for you,' or lose all this, eh?" Miss Sally deigned to make no reply, but smiled again, and went on with her work. "But I know what it is," resumed Brass after a short silence. "You're afraid you won't have as long a finger in the business as you've been used to have. Do you think I don't see through that? The business wouldn't go on very long, I expect, without me," returned his sister composedly. "Don't you be a fool and provoke me, Sammy, but mind what you're doing and do it." Samson Brass, who was at heart in great fear of his sister, sulkily bent over his writing again and listened as she said, "If I determined that the clerk ought not to come, of course he wouldn't be allowed to come. You know that well enough, so don't talk nonsense." Mr. Brass received this observation with increased meekness, merely remarking, under his breath, that he didn't like that kind of joking, and that Miss Sally would be a much better fellow if she forbore to aggravate him. To this compliment Miss Sally replied that she had a relish for the amusement, and had no intention to forego its gratification. Mr. Brass not caring, as it seemed, to pursue the subject any further, they both plied their pens at a great pace, and there the discussion ended. While they were thus employed, The window was suddenly darkened, as by some person standing close against it. As Mr. Brass and Miss Sally looked up to ascertain the cause, the top sash was nimbly lowered from without, and Quilp thrust in his head. "Hello," he said, standing on tiptoe on the window-sill and looking down into the room. "Is there anybody at home? Is there any of the devil's ware here? Is Brass at a premium, eh?" "Ha, ha, ha," laughed the lawyer in an affected ecstasy. "Oh, very good, sir. Oh, very good indeed. Quite eccentric. Dear me, what humor he has." "Is that my Sally?" croaked the dwarf, ogling the fair Miss Brass. "Is it justice with the bandage off her eyes, and without the sword and scales? Is it the strong arm of the law? Is it the Virgin of Bevis?" "What an amazing flow of spirits!" cried Brass. "Upon my word, it's quite extraordinary." "Open the door," said Quilp. "I've got him here. Such a clerk for you, Brass, such a prize, such an ace of trumps. Be quick and open the door, or if there's another lawyer near and he should happen to look out of window, he'll snap him up before your eyes, he will." It is probable that the loss of the Phoenix of clerks, even to a rival practitioner, would not have broken Mr. Brass's heart, but, pretending great alacrity, he rose from his seat, and going to the door, returned, introducing his client, who led by the hand no less a person than Mr. Richard Swiveller. "There she is," said Quilp, stopping short at the door, and wrinkling up his eyebrows as he looked towards Miss Sally. "There is the woman I ought to have married. There is the beautiful Sarah. There is the female who has all the charms of her sex and none of their weaknesses. Oh, Sally, Sally." To this amorous address Miss Brass briefly responded, "Bother. Hard-hearted as the metal from which she takes her name," said Quilp. "Why don't she change it? Melt down the brass and take another name." "Hold your nonsense, Mr. Quilp, do," returned Miss Sally with a grim smile. "I wonder you're not ashamed of yourself before a strange young man." "The strange young man," said Quilp, handing Dick Swiveller forward, "is too susceptible himself not to understand me well. This is Mr. Swiveller, my intimate friend, a gentleman of good family and great expectations, but who, having rather involved himself by youthful indiscretion, is content for a time to fill the humble station of a clerk, humble, but here most enviable. What a delicious atmosphere!" If Mr. Quilp spoke figuratively, and meant to imply that the air breathed by Miss Sally Brass was sweetened and rarefied by that dainty creature, he had doubtless good reason for what he said. But if he spoke of the delights of the atmosphere of Mr. Brass's office in a literal sense, he had certainly a peculiar taste, as it was of a close and earthy kind, and, besides being frequently impregnated with strong whiffs of the second-hand wearing apparel exposed for sale in Duke's Place and Houndsditch, had a decided flavor of rats and mice, and a taint of moldiness. Perhaps some doubts of its pure delight presented themselves to Mr. Swiveller, as he gave vent to one or two short abrupt sniffs, and looked incredulously at the grinning dwarf. "Mr. Swiveller," said Quilp, being pretty well accustomed to the agricultural pursuits of sowing wild oats, "Miss Sally prudently considers that half a loaf is better than no bread. To be out of harm's way he prudently thinks is something too, and therefore he accepts your brother's offer. Brass, Mr. Swiveller is yours." "I am very glad, sir," said Mr. Brass, "very glad indeed. Mr. Swiveller, sir, is fortunate enough to have your friendship. You may be very proud, sir, to have the friendship of Mr. Quilp." Dick murmured something about never wanting a friend or a bottle to give him, and also gasped forth his favorite allusion to the wing of friendship and its never molting a feather. But his faculties appeared to be absorbed in the contemplation of Miss Sally Brass, at whom he stared with blank and rueful looks, which delighted the watchful dwarf beyond measure. As to the divine Miss Sally herself, she rubbed her hands as men of business do, and took a few turns up and down the office with her pin behind her ear. "I suppose," said the dwarf, turning briskly to his legal friend, "that Mr. Swiveller enters upon his duties at once? It's Monday morning." "At once, if you please, sir, by all means," returned Brass. "Miss Sally will teach him law, the delightful study of the law," said Quilp, She'll be his guide, his friend, his companion, his Blackstone, his Coke upon Littleton, his young lawyer's best companion. He is exceedingly eloquent, said Brass, like a man abstracted, and looking at the roofs of the opposite houses with his hands in his pockets. He has an extraordinary flow of language. Beautiful, really. With Miss Sally, Quilp went on, and the beautiful fictions of the law, his days will pass like minutes. Those charming creations of the poet John Doe and Richard Roe, when they first dawn upon him, will open a new world for the enlargement of his mind and the improvement of his heart. Oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful indeed, cried Brass. It's a treat to hear him. Where will Mr. Swiveller sit? Said Quilp, looking round. Why, we'll buy another stool, sir, returned Brass. We hadn't any thoughts of having a gentleman with us, sir, until you were kind enough to suggest it, and our accommodation's not extensive. We'll look about for a second-hand stool, sir. In the meantime, if Mr. Swiveller will take my seat, and try his hand at a fair copy of this ejectment, as I shall be out pretty well all the morning. Walk with me, said Quilp. I have a word or two to say to you on points of business. Can you spare the time? Can I spare the time to walk with you, sir? You're joking, sir. You're joking with me, replied the lawyer, putting on his hat. I'm ready, sir, quite ready. My time must be fully occupied indeed, sir, not to leave me time to walk with you. It's not everybody, sir, who has an opportunity of improving himself by the conversation of Mr. Quilp. The dwarf glanced sarcastically at his brazen friend, and, with a short, dry cough, turned upon his heel to bid adieu to Miss Sally, after a very gallant parting on his side, and a very cool and gentlemanly sort of one on hers. He nodded to Dick Swiveller, and withdrew with the attorney. Dick stood at the desk in a state of utter stupefaction, staring with all his might at the beauteous Sally, as if she had been some curious animal whose like had never lived. When the dwarf got into the street, he mounted again upon the window-sill, and looked into the office for a moment with a grinning face, as a man might peep into a cage. Dick glanced upward at him, but without any token of recognition, and long after he had disappeared, still stood gazing upon Miss Sally Brass, seeing or thinking of nothing else, and rooted to the spot. Miss Brass, being by this time deep in the bill of costs, took no notice whatever of Dick, but went scratching on with a noisy pen, scoring down the figures with evident delight, and working like a steam engine. There stood Dick, gazing now at the green gown, now at the brown headdress, now at the face, and now at the rapid pen, in a state of stupid perplexity, wondering how he got into the company of that strange monster, and whether it was a dream and he would ever wake. At last he heaved a deep sigh, and began slowly pulling off his coat. Mr. Swiveller pulled off his coat, and folded it up with great elaboration, staring at Miss Sally all the time. Then put on a blue jacket with a double row of gilt buttons, which he had originally ordered for aquatic expeditions, but had brought with him that morning for office purposes, and, still keeping his eye upon her, suffered himself to drop down silently upon Mr. Brass's stool. Then he underwent a relapse, and becoming powerless again, rested his chin upon his hand, and opened his eyes so wide that it appeared quite out of the question that he could ever close them any more. When he had looked so long that he could see nothing, Dick took his eyes off the fair object of his amazement, turned over the leaves of the draft he was to copy, dipped his pen into the inkstand, and at last, and by slow approaches, began to write. But he had not written half a dozen words when, reaching over to the inkstand to take a fresh dip, he happened to raise his eyes. There was the intolerable brown headdress. There was the green gown. There, in short, was Miss Sally Brass, arrayed in all her charms, and more tremendous than ever. This happened so often that Mr. Swiveller by degrees began to feel strange influences creeping over him, horrible desires to annihilate this Sally Brass, mysterious promptings to knock her headdress off and try how she looked without it. There was a very large ruler on the table, a large, black, shining ruler. Mr. Swiveller took it up and began to rub his nose with it. from rubbing his nose with the ruler to poising it in his hand and giving it an occasional flourish after the tomahawk manner. The transition was easy and natural. In some of these flourishes it went close to Miss Sally's head. The ragged edges of the headdress fluttered with the wind it raised. Advance it but an inch, and that great brown knot was on the ground. Yet still the unconscious maiden worked away and never raised her eyes. Well, this was a great relief. It was a good thing to write doggedly and obstinately until he was desperate, and then snatch up the ruler and whirl it about the brown headdress with the consciousness that he could have it off if he liked. It was a good thing to draw it back and rub his nose very hard with it, if he thought Miss Sally was going to look up, and to recompense himself with more hearty flourishes when he found she was still absorbed. By these means Mr. Swiveller calmed the agitation of his feelings, until his applications to the ruler became less fierce and frequent, and he could even write as many as half a dozen consecutive lines without having recourse to it, which was a great victory. Chapter 34. In course of time, that is to say, after a couple of hours or so of diligent application, Miss Brass arrived at the conclusion of her task, and recorded the fact by wiping her pen upon the green gown, and taking a pinch of snuff from a little round tin box which she carried in her pocket. Having disposed of this temperate refreshment, she arose from her stool, tied her papers into a formal packet with red tape, and taking them under her arm, marched out of the office. Mr. Swiveller had scarcely sprung off his seat and commenced the performance of a maniac hornpipe, when he was interrupted, in the fullness of his joy at being again alone, by the opening of the door and the reappearance of Miss Sally's head. "I am going out," said Miss Brass. "Very good, ma'am," returned Dick. "And don't hurry yourself on my account to come back, ma'am," he added inwardly. "If anybody comes on office business, take their messages, and say that the gentleman who attends to that matter isn't in at present, will you?" said Miss Brass. "I will, ma'am," replied Dick. "I shan't be very long," said Miss Brass, retiring. "I'm sorry to hear it, ma'am," rejoined Dick when she had shut the door. "I hope you may be unexpectedly detained, ma'am. If you could manage to be run over, ma'am, but not seriously, so much the better." Uttering these expressions of goodwill with extreme gravity, Mr. Swiveller sat down in the client's chair and pondered, then took a few turns up and down the room and fell into the chair again. "So I'm Brass's clerk, am I?" said Dick. "Brass's clerk? Eh? And the clerk of Brass's sister, clerk to a female dragon. Very good, very good. What shall I be next? Shall I be a convict in a felt hat and a gray suit, trotting about a dockyard with my number neatly embroidered on my uniform and the order of the garter on my leg, restrained from chafing my ankle by a twisted Belcher handkerchief? Shall I be that? Will that do? Or is it too genteel? Whatever you please, have it your own way, of course." As he was entirely alone, it may be presumed that, in these remarks, Mr. Swiveller addressed himself to his fate or destiny, whom, as we learn by the precedents, it is the custom of heroes to taunt in a very bitter and ironical manner when they find themselves in situations of an unpleasant nature. This is the more probable from the circumstance of Mr. Swiveller directing his observations to the ceiling, which these bodily personages are usually supposed to inhabit, except in theatrical cases, when they live in the heart of the great chandelier. "Quilp offers me this place, which he says he can insure me," resumed Dick after a thoughtful silence, and telling off the circumstances of his position, one by one, upon his fingers. Fred, who, I could have taken my affidavit, would not have heard of such a thing, backs Quilp to my astonishment, and urges me to take it also. Staggerer, number 1. My aunt in the country stops the supplies, and writes an affectionate note to say that she has made a new will, and left me out of it. Staggerer, number 2. No money, no credit, no support from Fred, who seems to turn steady all at once. Notice to quit the old lodgings. Staggerers 3, 4, 5, and 6. Under an accumulation of staggerers, no man can be considered a free agent. No man knocks himself down. If his destiny knocks him down, his destiny must pick him up again. Then I'm very glad that mine has brought all this upon itself, and I shall be as careless as I can, and make myself quite at home to spite it. So go on, my buck, said Mr. Swiveller, taking his leave of the ceiling with a significant nod, and let us see which of us will be tired first. Dismissing the subject of his downfall with these reflections, which were no doubt very profound, and are indeed not altogether unknown in certain systems of moral philosophy, Mr. Swiveller shook off his despondency and assumed the cheerful ease of an irresponsible clerk. As a means towards his composure and self-possession, he entered into a more minute examination of the office than he had yet had time to make, looked into the wig box, the books, and ink bottle, untied and inspected all the papers, carved a few devices on the table with a sharp blade of Mr. Brass's penknife, and wrote his name on the inside of the wooden coal scuttle. Having, as it were, taken formal possession of his clerkship in virtue of these proceedings, he opened the window and leaned negligently out of it until a beer boy happened to pass, whom he commanded to set down his tray and to serve him with a pint of mild porter, which he drank upon the spot and promptly paid for, with the view of breaking ground for a system of future credit and opening a correspondence tending thereto, without loss of time. Then 3 or 4 little boys dropped in, on legal errands from 3 or 4 attorneys of the brass grade, whom Mr. Swiveller received and dismissed with about as professional a manner, and as correct and comprehensive an understanding of their business, as would have been shown by a clown in a pantomime under similar circumstances. These things done and over, he got upon his stool again and tried his hand at drawing caricatures of Miss Brass with a pen and ink, whistling very cheerfully all the time. He was occupied in this diversion when a coach stopped near the door, and presently afterwards there was a loud double knock. As this was no business of Mr. Swiveller's, the person not ringing the office bell, he pursued his diversion with perfect composure, notwithstanding that he rather thought there was nobody else in the house. In this, however, he was mistaken. For, after the knock had been repeated with increased impatience, the door was opened, and somebody with a very heavy tread went up the stairs and into the room above. Mr. Swiveller was wondering whether this might be another Miss Brass, twin sister to the dragon, when there came a rapping of knuckles at the office door. "Come in," said Dick. "Don't stand upon ceremony. The business will get rather complicated if I've many more customers. Come in." "Oh, please," said a little voice very low down in the doorway. "Will you come and show the lodgings?" Dick leant over the table and descried a small slipshod girl in a dirty coarse apron and bib, which left nothing of her visible but her face and feet. She might as well have been dressed in a violin case. "Why, who are you?" said Dick, to which the only reply was, "Oh, please will you come and show the lodgings?" There never was such an old-fashioned child in her looks and manner. She must have been at work from her cradle. She seemed as much afraid of Dick as Dick was amazed at her. "I haven't got anything to do with the lodgings," said Dick. "Tell him to call again." "Oh, but please will you come and show the lodgings," returned the girl. "It's 18 shillings a week, and us finding plate and linen, boots and clothes is extra, and fires in winter-time is 8 pence a day. Why don't you show 'em yourself?" "You seem to know all about 'em," said Dick. "Miss Sally said I wasn't to, because people wouldn't believe the attendance was good if they saw how small I was first." "Well, but they'll see how small you are afterwards, won't they?" said Dick. "Ah, but then they'll have taken him for a fortnight certain," replied the child with a shrewd look. "And people don't like moving when they're once settled." "This is a queer sort of thing," muttered Dick, rising. "What do you mean to say you are? The cook?" "Yes, I do plain cooking," replied the child. "I'm housemaid too. I do all the work of the house. I suppose Brass and the dragon and I do the dirtiest part of it," thought Dick, and he might have thought much more, being in a doubtful and hesitating mood, but that the girl again urged her request, and certain mysterious bumping sounds on the passage and staircase seemed to give note of the applicant's impatience. Richard Swiveller, therefore, sticking a pin behind each ear, and carrying another in his mouth as a token of his great importance and devotion to business, hurried out to meet and treat with the single gentleman. He was a little surprised to perceive that the bumping sounds were occasioned by the progress upstairs of the single gentleman's trunk, which, being nearly twice as wide as the staircase and exceedingly heavy withal, it was no easy matter for the united exertions of the single gentleman and the coachman to convey up the steep ascent. But there they were, crushing each other, and pushing and pulling with all their might, and getting the trunk tight and fast in all kinds of impossible angles, and to pass them was out of the question. For which sufficient reason, Mr. Swiveller followed slowly behind, entering a new protest on every stair against the house of Mr. Sampson Brass being thus taken by storm. To these remonstrances, the single gentleman answered not a word, but when the trunk was at last got into the bedroom, sat down upon it and wiped his bald head and face with his handkerchief. He was very warm, and well he might be, for, not to mention the exertion of getting the trunk upstairs, he was closely muffled in winter garments, though the thermometer had stood all day at 81 in the shade. "I believe, sir," said Richard Swiveller, taking his pen out of his mouth, "that you desire to look at these apartments. They are very charming apartments, sir. They command an uninterrupted view of over the way, and they are within 1 minute's walk of the corner of the street. There is exceedingly mild porter, sir, in the immediate vicinity, and the contingent advantages are extraordinary." "What's the rent?" said the single gentleman. £1 per week," replied Dick, improving on the terms. "I'll take 'em." "The boots and clothes are extras," said Dick, "and the fires in winter-time are all agreed to," answered the single gentleman. "2 weeks certain," said Dick. "Are the 2 weeks?" cried the single gentleman gruffly, eyeing him from top to toe. 2 years. I shall live here for 2 years. Here, £10 down. The bargain's made." "Why, you see," said Dick, "my name is not Brass, and—" "Who said it was? My name's not Brass." "What then?" "The name of the master of the house is," said Dick. "I'm glad of it," returned the single gentleman. "It's a good name for a lawyer. Coachman, you may go." "So may you, sir." Mr. Swiveller was so much confounded by the single gentleman riding roughshod over him at this rate, that he stood looking at him almost as hard as he had looked at Miss Sally. The single gentleman, however, was not in the slightest degree affected by this circumstance, but proceeded with perfect composure to unwind the shawl which was tied round his neck, and then to pull off his boots. Freed of these encumbrances, he went on to divest himself of his other clothing, which he folded up, piece by piece, and ranged in order on the trunk. Then he pulled down the window blinds, drew the curtains, wound up his watch, and, quite leisurely and methodically, got into bed. "Take down the bill," were his parting words as he looked out from between the curtains, "and let nobody call me till I ring the bell." With that the curtains closed, and he seemed to snore immediately. "This is a most remarkable and supernatural sort of house," said Mr. Swiveller, as he walked into the office with the bill in his hand. "She-dragons in the business, conducting themselves like professional gentlemen. Plain cooks of 3 feet high appearing mysteriously from underground. Strangers walking in and going to bed without leave or license in the middle of the day. If he should be one of the miraculous fellows that turn up now and then, and has gone to sleep for 2 years, I shall be in a pleasant situation. It's my destiny, however, and I hope Brass may like it. I shall be sorry if you don't, but it's no business of mine. I have nothing whatever to do with it." Chapter 35. Mr. Brass, on returning home, received the report of his clerk with much complacency and satisfaction, and was particular in inquiring after the £10 note, which, proving on examination to be a good and lawful note of the Governor and Company of the Bank of England, increased his good humour considerably. Indeed, he so overflowed with liberality and condescension, that, in the fullness of his heart, he invited Mr. Swiveller to partake of a bowl of punch with him at that remote and indefinite period which is currently denominated one of these days, and paid him many handsome compliments on the uncommon aptitude for business which his conduct on the first day of his devotion to it had so plainly evinced. It was a maxim with Mr. Brass that the habit of paying compliments kept a man's tongue oiled without any expense, and, as that useful member ought never to grow rusty or creak in turning on its hinges in the case of a practitioner of the law, in whom it should be always glib and easy, he lost few opportunities of improving himself by the utterance of handsome speeches and eulogistic expressions, and this had passed into such a habit with him, that, if he could not be correctly said to have his tongue at his fingers' ends, he might certainly be said to have it anywhere but in his face, which being, as we have already seen, of a harsh and repulsive character, was not oiled so easily, but frowned above all the smooth speeches, one of nature's beacons, warning off those who navigated the shoals and breakers of the world, or of that dangerous strait the law, and admonishing them to seek less treacherous harbors and try their fortune elsewhere. While Mr. Brass by turns overwhelmed his clerk with compliments and inspected the 10-pound note, Miss Sally showed little emotion and that of no pleasurable kind, for as the tendency of her legal practice had been to fix her thoughts on small gains and gripings, and to whet and sharpen her natural wisdom, she was not a little disappointed that the single gentleman had obtained the lodgings at such an easy rate, arguing that when he was seen to have set his mind upon them, he should have been at the least charged double or treble the usual terms, and that, in exact proportion as he pressed forward, Mr. Swiveller should have hung back. But neither the good opinion of Mr. Brass, nor the dissatisfaction of Miss Sally, wrought any impression upon that young gentleman, who, throwing the responsibility of this and all other acts and deeds thereafter to be done by him, upon his unlucky destiny, was quite resigned and comfortable, fully prepared for the worst, and philosophically indifferent to the best. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," said Brass, on the second day of Mr. Swiveller's clerkship. "Sally found you a second-hand stool, sir, yesterday evening in Whitechapel. She's a rare fellow at a bargain. I can tell you, Mr. Richard, you'll find that a first-rate stool, sir, take my word for it." "It's rather a crazy one to look at," said Dick. "You'll find it a most amazing stool to sit down upon, you may depend," returned Mr. Brass. "It was bought in the open street, just opposite the hospital, and as it has been standing there a month of two, it has got rather dusty and a little brown from being in the sun, that's all." "I hope it hasn't got any fevers or anything of that sort in it," said Dick, sitting himself down discontentedly between Mr. Sampson and the chaste Sally. "One of the legs is longer than the others." "Then we get a bit of timber in, sir," retorted Brass. "Ha, ha, ha. We get a bit of timber in, sir, and that's another advantage of my sister's going to market for us. Miss Brass, Mr. Richard is the—" "Will you keep quiet?" interrupted the fair subject of these remarks, looking up from her papers. "How am I to work if you keep on chattering?" "What an uncertain chap you are," returned the lawyer. "Sometimes you're all for a chat. At another time you're all for work. A man never knows what humor he'll find you in." "I'm in a working humor now," said Sally, "so don't disturb me, if you please. And don't take him," Miss Sally pointed with the feather of her pen to Richard, "off his business. He won't do more than he can help, I dare say." Mr. Brass had evidently a strong inclination to make an angry reply, but was deterred by prudent or timid considerations, as he only muttered something about aggravation and a vagabond, not associating the terms with any individual, but mentioning them as connected with some abstract ideas which happened to occur to him. They went on writing for a long time in silence after this, in such a dull silence that Mr. Swiveller, who required excitement, had several times fallen asleep and written divers strange words in an unknown character with his eyes shut, when Miss Sally at length broke in upon the monotony of the office by pulling out the little tin box, taking a noisy pinch of snuff, and then expressing her opinion that Mr. Richard Swiveller had done it. "Done what, ma'am?" said Richard. "Do you know," returned Miss Brass, "that the lodger isn't up yet, that nothing has been seen or heard of him since he went to bed yesterday afternoon?" "Well, ma'am," said Dick, "I suppose he may sleep his 10 pound out in peace and quietness if he likes." "Ah, I begin to think he'll never wake," observed Miss Sally. "It's a very remarkable circumstance," said Brass, laying down his pen. "Really, very remarkable. Mr. Richard, you'll remember, if this gentleman should be found to have hung himself to the bedpost, or any unpleasant accident of that kind should happen, you'll remember, Mr. Richard, that this £10 note was given to you in part payment of 2 years' rent? You'll bear that in mind, Mr. Richard. You had better make a note of it, sir, in case you should ever be called upon to give evidence. Mr. Swiveller took a large sheet of foolscap, and with a countenance of profound gravity, began to make a very small note in one corner. "We can never be too cautious," said Mr. Brass. "There is a deal of wickedness going about the world, a deal of wickedness. Did the gentleman happen to say, sir, but never mind that at present, sir, finish that little memorandum first?" Dick did so, and handed it to Mr. Brass, who had dismounted from his stool and was walking up and down the office. "Oh, this is the memorandum, is it?" said Brass, running his eye over the document. "Very good. Now, Mr. Richard, did the gentleman say anything else?" "No." "Are you sure, Mr. Richard," said Brass solemnly, "that the gentleman said nothing else?" "Devil a word, sir," replied Dick. "Think again, sir," said Brass. "It's my duty, sir, in the position in which I stand, and as an honorable member of the legal profession, the first profession in this country, sir, or in any other country, or in any of the planets that shine above us at night and are supposed to be inhabited. It's my duty, sir, as an honorable member of that profession, not to put to you a leading question in a matter of this delicacy and importance. Did the gentleman, sir, who took the first floor of you yesterday afternoon, and who brought with him a box of property, say anything more than is set down in this memorandum?" "Come, don't be a fool," said Miss Sally. Dick looked at her, and then at Brass, and then at Miss Sally again, and still said, "No." "Pooh, deuce take it, Mr. Richard, how dull you are," cried Brass, relaxing into a smile. "Did he say anything about his property? There. That's the way to put it," said Miss Sally, nodding to her brother. "Did he say, for instance," added Brass in a kind of comfortable, cozy tone, "I don't assert that he did say so, mind. I only ask you, to refresh your memory, did he say, for instance, that he was a stranger in London, that it was not his humor or within his ability to give any references, that he felt we had a right to require them, and that, in case anything should happen to him at any time, he particularly desired that whatever property he had upon the premises should be considered mine, as some slight recompense for the trouble and annoyance I should sustain? And were you, in short," added Brass, still more comfortably and cozily than before, "were you induced to accept him on my behalf as a tenant upon those conditions?" "Certainly not," replied Dick. "Why then, Mr. Richard," said Brass, darting at him a supercilious and reproachful look, "it's my opinion that you've mistaken your calling, and will never make a lawyer." "Not if you live 1,000 years," added Miss Sally. Whereupon the brother and sister took each a noisy pinch of snuff from the little tin box, and fell into a gloomy thoughtfulness. Nothing further passed up to Mr. Swiveller's dinner time, which was at 3 o'clock, and seemed about 3 weeks in coming. At the first stroke of the hour, the new clerk disappeared. At the last stroke of 5, he reappeared, and the office, as if by magic, became fragrant with the smell of gin and water and lemon peel. "Mr. Richard," said Brass, "this man's not up yet. Nothing will wake him, sir. What's to be done?" "I should let him have his sleep out," returned Dick. "Sleep out!" cried Brass. "Why, he has been asleep now 26 hours. We have been moving chests of drawers over his head. We have knocked double knocks at the street door. We have made the servant girl fall downstairs several times. She's a lightweight, and it don't hurt her much. But nothing wakes him." "Perhaps a ladder," suggested Dick, "and getting in at the first-floor window. But then there's a door between. Besides, the neighbors would be up in arms," said Brass. "What do you say to getting on the roof of the house through the trapdoor and dropping down the chimney?" suggested Dick. "That would be an excellent plan," said Brass, "if anybody would be," and here he looked very hard at Mr. Swiveller, "would be kind and friendly and generous enough to undertake it. I dare say it would not be anything like as disagreeable as one supposes. Dick had made the suggestion, thinking that the duty might possibly fall within Miss Sally's department. As he said nothing further and declined taking the hint, Mr. Brass was fain to propose that they should go upstairs together and make a last effort to awaken the sleeper by some less violent means, which, if they failed on this last trial, must positively be succeeded by stronger measures. Mr. Swiveller, assenting, armed himself with his stool and the large ruler, and repaired with his employer to the scene of action, where Miss Brass was already ringing a handbell with all her might, and yet without producing the smallest effect upon their mysterious lodger. "There are his boots, Mr. Richard," said Brass. "Very obstinate-looking articles they are, too," quoth Richard Swiveller, and truly, they were as sturdy and bluff a pair of boots as one would wish to see, as firmly planted on the ground as if their owner's legs and feet had been in them, and seeming, with their broad soles and blunt toes, to hold possession of their place by main force. "I can't see anything but the curtain of the bed," said Brass, applying his eye to the keyhole of the door. "Is he a strong man, Mr. Richard?" "Very," answered Dick. "It would be an extremely unpleasant circumstance if he was to bounce out suddenly," said Brass. "Keep the stairs clear. I should be more than a match for him, of course, but I'm the master of the house, and the laws of hospitality must be respected. Hello there. Hello, hello." While Mr. Brass, with his eye curiously twisted into the keyhole, uttered these sounds as a means of attracting the lodger's attention, and while Miss Brass plied the handbell, Mr. Swiveller put his stool close against the wall by the side of the door, and mounting on the top and standing bolt upright, so that if the lodger did make a rush, he would most probably pass him in its onward fury, began a violent battery with the ruler upon the upper panels of the door. Captivated with his own ingenuity and confident in the strength of his position, which he had taken up after the method of those hardy individuals who open the pit and gallery doors of theaters on crowded nights, Mr. Swiveller rained down such a shower of blows that the noise of the bell was drowned, and the small servant, who lingered on the stairs below, ready to fly at a moment's notice, was obliged to hold her ears lest she should be rendered deaf for life. Suddenly the door was unlocked on the inside, and flung violently open. The small servant flew to the coal cellar. Miss Sally dived into her own bedroom. Mr. Brass, who was not remarkable for personal courage, ran into the next street, and finding that nobody followed him, armed with a poker or other offensive weapon, put his hands in his pockets, walked very slowly all at once, and whistled. Meanwhile, Mr. Swiveller, on the top of the stool, drew himself into as flat a shape as possible against the wall, and looked, not unconcernedly, down upon the single gentleman, who appeared at the door growling and cursing in a very awful manner, and, with the boots in his hand, seemed to have an intention of hurling them downstairs on speculation. This idea, however, he abandoned. He was turning into his room again, still growling vengefully, when his eyes met those of the watchful Richard. "Have you been making that horrible noise?" said the single gentleman. "I have been helping, sir," returned Dick, keeping his eye upon him, and waving the ruler gently in his right hand, as an indication of what the single gentleman had to expect if he attempted any violence. "How dare you, then?" said the lodger. "Eh?" To this, Dick made no other reply than by inquiring whether the lodger held it to be consistent with the conduct and character of a gentleman to go to sleep for 26 hours at a stretch, and whether the peace of an amiable and virtuous family was to weigh as nothing in the balance. "Is my peace nothing?" said the single gentleman. "Is their peace nothing, sir?" returned Dick. "I don't wish to hold out any threats, sir. Indeed, the law does not allow of threats, for to threaten is an indictable offense. But if ever you do that again, take care you're not sat upon by the coroner and buried in a crossroad before you wake." "We have been distracted with fears that you were dead, sir," said Dick, gently sliding to the ground. "And the short and the long of it is, that we cannot allow single gentlemen to come into this establishment and sleep like double gentlemen without paying extra for it." "Indeed!" cried the lodger. "Yes, sir, indeed," returned Dick, yielding to his destiny and saying whatever came uppermost. An equal quantity of slumber was never got out of one bed and bedstead, and if you're going to sleep in that way, you must pay for a double-bedded room. Instead of being thrown into a greater passion by these remarks, the lodger lapsed into a broad grin and looked at Mr. Swiveller with twinkling eyes. He was a brown-faced, sunburnt man, and appeared browner and more sunburnt from having a white nightcap on. As it was clear that he was a choleric fellow in some respects, Mr. Swiveller was relieved to find him in such good humor, and, to encourage him in it, smiled himself. The lodger, in the testiness of being so rudely roused, had pushed his nightcap very much on one side of his bald head. This gave him a rakish eccentric air which, now that he had leisure to observe it, charmed Mr. Swiveller exceedingly. Therefore, by way of propitiation, he expressed his hope that the gentleman was going to get up, and further that he would never do so any more. "Come here, you impudent rascal," was the lodger's answer as he re-entered his room. Mr. Swiveller followed him in, leaving the stool outside, but reserving the ruler in case of a surprise. He rather congratulated himself on his prudence when the single gentleman, without notice or explanation of any kind, double-locked the door. "Can you drink anything?" was his next inquiry. Mr. Swiveller replied that he had very recently been assuaging the pangs of thirst, but that he was still open to a modest quencher, if the materials were at hand. Without another word spoken on either side, the lodger took from his great trunk a kind of temple, shining as of polished silver, and placed it carefully on the table. Greatly interested in his proceedings, Mr. Swiveller observed him closely. Into one little chamber of this temple he dropped an egg, into another some coffee, into a third a compact piece of raw steak from a neat tin case, into a fourth he poured some water. Then, with the aid of a phosphorus box and some matches, he procured a light and applied it to a spirit lamp which had a place of its own below the temple. Then he shut down the lids of all the little chambers. Then he opened them, and then, by some wonderful and unseen agency, the steak was done, the egg was boiled, the coffee was accurately prepared, and his breakfast was ready. "Hot water," said the lodger, handing it to Mr. Swiveller with as much coolness as if he had a kitchen fire before him. "Extraordinary rum, sugar, and a traveling glass. Mix for yourself, and make haste." Dick complied, his eyes wandering all the time from the temple on the table, which seemed to do everything, to the great trunk which seemed to hold everything. The lodger took his breakfast like a man who was used to work these miracles, and thought nothing of them. "The man of the house is a lawyer, is he not?" said the lodger. Dick nodded. The rum was amazing. "The woman of the house, what's she?" "A dragon," said Dick. The single gentleman, perhaps because he had met with such things in his travels, or perhaps because he was a single gentleman, evinced no surprise, but merely inquired, "Wife or sister?" "Sister," said Dick. "So much the better," said the single gentleman. "He can get rid of her when he likes." "I want to do as I like, young man," he added after a short silence. "To go to bed when I like, get up when I like, come in when I like, go out when I like, to be asked no questions and be surrounded by no spies. In this last respect, servants are the devil. There's only one here." "And a very little one," said Dick. "And a very little one," repeated the lodger. "Well, the place will suit me, will it?" "Yes," said Dick. "Sharks, I suppose?" said the lodger. Dick nodded assent and drained his glass. "Let them know my humor," said the single gentleman, rising. "If they disturb me, they lose a good tenant. If they know me to be that, they know enough. If they try to know more, it's a notice to quit. It's better to understand these things at once. Good day." "I beg your pardon," said Dick, halting in his passage to the door, which the lodger prepared to open. "When he who adores thee has left but the name." "What do you mean?" "But the name," said Dick, "has left but the name. In case of letters or parcels." "I never have any," returned the lodger, "or in the case anybody should call. Nobody ever calls on me." If any mistake should arise from not having the name, don't say it was my fault, sir, added Dick, still lingering. Oh, blame not the bard. I'll blame nobody, said the lodger, with such irascibility that in a moment Dick found himself on the staircase and the locked door between them. Mr. Brass and Miss Sally were lurking hard by, having been, indeed, only routed from the keyhole by Mr. Swiveller's abrupt exit, as their utmost exertions had not enabled them to overhear a word of the interview. However, in consequence of a quarrel for precedence, which, though limited of necessity to pushes and pinches and such quiet pantomime, had lasted the whole time, they hurried him down to the office to hear his account of the conversation. This Mr. Swiveller gave them, faithfully as regarded the wishes and character of the single gentleman, and poetically as concerned the great trunk, of which he gave a description more remarkable for brilliancy of imagination than a strict adherence to truth, declaring with many strong asseverations that it contained a specimen of every kind of rich food and wine known in these times, and in particular that it was of a self-acting kind and served up whatever was required, as he supposed by clockwork. He also gave them to understand that the cooking apparatus roasted a fine piece of sirloin of beef, weighing about 6 pounds avoirdupois, in 2 minutes and a quarter, as he had himself witnessed and proved by his sense of taste, and further, that, however the effect was produced, he had distinctly seen water boil and bubble up when the single gentleman winked, from which facts he, Mr. Swiveller, was led to infer that the lodger was some great conjurer or chemist, or both, whose residence under that roof could not fail at some future days to shed a great credit and distinction on the name of Brass, and add a new interest to the history of Bevis Marks. There was one point which Mr. Swiveller deemed it unnecessary to enlarge upon, and that was the fact of the modest quencher, which, by reason of its intrinsic strength and its coming close upon the heels of the temperate beverage he had discussed at dinner, awakened a slight degree of fever, and rendered necessary 2 or 3 other modest quenchers at the public-house in the course of the evening. Chapter 36. As the single gentleman, after some weeks' occupation of his lodgings, still declined to correspond, by word or gesture, either with Mr. Brass or his sister Sally, but invariably chose Richard Swiveller as his channel of communication, and as he proved himself in all respects a highly desirable inmate, paying for everything beforehand, giving very little trouble, making no noise, and keeping early hours, Mr. Richard imperceptibly rose to an important position in the family as one who had influence over this mysterious lodger and could negotiate with him for good or evil when nobody else durst approach his person. If the truth must be told, even Mr. Swiveller's approaches to the single gentleman were of a very distant kind, and met with small encouragement. But, as he never returned from a monosyllabic conference with the unknown, without quoting such expressions as "Swiveller, I know I can rely upon you. I have no hesitation in saying, Swiveller, that I entertain a regard for you. Swiveller, you are my friend, and will stand by me, I am sure," with many other short speeches of the same familiar and confiding kind, purporting to have been addressed by the single gentleman to himself, and to form the staple of their ordinary discourse. Neither Mr. Brass nor Miss Sally for a moment questioned the extent of his influence, but accorded to him their fullest and most unqualified belief. But quite apart from, and independent of, this source of popularity, Mr. Swiveller had another, which promised to be equally enduring, and to lighten his position considerably. He found favor in the eyes of Miss Sally Brass. Let not the light scorners of female fascination erect their ears to listen to a new tale of love which shall serve them for a jest. For Miss Brass, however accurately formed to be beloved, was not of the loving kind. That amiable virgin, having clung to the skirts of the law from her earliest youth, having sustained herself by their aid, as it were, in her first running alone, and maintained a firm grasp upon them ever since, had passed her life in a kind of legal childhood. She had been remarkable, when a tender prattler, for an uncommon talent in counterfeiting the walk and manner of a bailiff, in which character she had learned to tap her little playfellows on the shoulder, and to carry them off to imaginary sponging houses, with a correctness of imitation which was the surprise and delight of all who witnessed her performances, and which was only to be exceeded by her exquisite manner of putting an execution into her doll's house, and taking an exact inventory of the chairs and tables. These artless sports had naturally soothed and cheered the decline of her widowed father, a most exemplary gentleman, called Old Foxy by his friends from his extreme sagacity, who encouraged them to the utmost, and whose chief regret, on finding that he drew near to Houndsditch churchyard, was that his daughter could not take out an attorney's certificate and hold a place upon the roll. Filled with this affectionate and touching sorrow, he had solemnly confided her to his son Sampson as an invaluable auxiliary, and from the old gentleman's decease to the period of which we treat, Miss Sally Brass had been the prop and pillar of his business. It is obvious that, having devoted herself from infancy to this one pursuit and study, Miss Brass could know but little of the world, otherwise than in connection with the law, and that from a lady gifted with such high tastes, proficiency in those gentler and softer arts in which women usually excel was scarcely to be looked for. Miss Sally's accomplishments were all of a masculine and strictly legal kind. They began with the practice of an attorney and they ended with it. She was in a state of lawful innocence, so to speak. The law had been her nurse, and as bandy legs or such physical deformities in children are held to be the consequence of bad nursing, so, if in a mind so beautiful any moral twist or handiness could be found, Miss Sally Brass's nurse was alone to blame. It was upon this lady, then, that Mr. Swiveller burst in full freshness as something new and hitherto undreamed of, lighting up the office with scraps of song and merriment, conjuring with inkstands and boxes of wafers, catching 3 oranges in one hand, balancing stools upon his chin and penknives on his nose, and constantly performing 100 other feats with equal ingenuity. For with such unbendings did Richard, in Mr. Brass's absence, relieve the tedium of his confinement. These social qualities, which Miss Sally first discovered by accident, gradually made such an impression upon her that she would entreat Mr. Swiveller to relax as though she were not by, which Mr. Swiveller, nothing loath, would readily consent to do. By these means a friendship sprung up between them. Mr. Swiveller gradually came to look upon her as her brother Sampson did, and as he would have looked upon any other clerk. He imparted to her the mystery of going the odd man or plain Newmarket for fruit, ginger beer, baked potatoes, or even a modest quencher, of which Miss Brass did not scruple to partake. He would often persuade her to undertake his share of writing in addition to her own. Nay, he would sometimes reward her with a hearty slap on the back, and protest that she was a devilish good fellow, a jolly dog, and so forth. All of which compliments Miss Sally would receive in entire good part and with perfect satisfaction. One circumstance troubled Mr. Swiveller's mind very much, and that was that the small servant always remained somewhere in the bowels of the earth under Bevis Marks, and never came to the surface unless the single gentleman rang his bell, when she would answer it and immediately disappear again. She never went out, or came into the office, or had a clean face, or took off the coarse apron, or looked out of any one of the windows, or stood at the street door for a breath of air, or had any rest or enjoyment whatever. Nobody ever came to see her, nobody spoke of her, nobody cared about her. Mr. Brass had said once that he believed she was a love child, which means anything but a child of love, and that was all the information Richard Swiveller could obtain. "It's of no use asking the dragon," thought Dick one day, as he sat contemplating the features of Miss Sally Brass. "I suspect if I asked any questions on that head, our alliance would be at an end. I wonder whether she is a dragon by the by, or something in the mermaid way. She has rather a scaly appearance, but mermaids are fond of looking at themselves in the glass, which she can't be, and they have a habit of combing their hair, which she hasn't. No, she's a dragon." "Where are you going, old fellow?" said Dick aloud, as Miss Sally wiped her pin as usual on the green dress, and uprose from her seat. "To dinner," answered the dragon. "To dinner," thought Dick. "That's another circumstance. I don't believe that small servant ever has anything to eat." "Sammy won't be home," said Miss Brass. "Stop till I come back. I shan't be long." Dick nodded and followed Miss Brass, with his eyes to the door and with his ears to a little back parlor where she and her brother took their meals. "Now," said Dick, walking up and down with his hands in his pockets, "I'd give something, if I had it, to know how they use that child and where they keep her. My mother must have been a very inquisitive woman. I have no doubt I'm marked with a note of interrogation somewhere. My feelings I smother, but thou hast been the cause of this anguish. Upon my word," said Mr. Swiveller, checking himself and falling thoughtfully into the client's chair, "I should like to know how they use her." After running on, in this way, for some time, Mr. Swiveller softly opened the office door, with the intention of darting across the street for a glass of the mild porter. At that moment he caught a parting glimpse of the brown headdress of Miss Brass flitting down the kitchen stairs. "And by Jove," thought Dick, "she's going to feed the small servant. Now or never." First peeping over the handrail and allowing the headdress to disappear in the darkness below, he groped his way down, and arrived at the door of a back kitchen immediately after Miss Brass had entered the same, bearing in her hand a cold leg of mutton. It was a very dark, miserable place, very low and very damp, the walls disfigured by 1,000 rents and blotches. The water was trickling out of a leaky butt, and a most wretched cat was lapping up the drops with the sickly eagerness of starvation. The grate, which was a wide one, was wound and screwed up tight, so as to hold no more than a little thin sandwich of fire. Everything was locked up. The coal cellar, the candle box, the salt box, the meat safe, were all padlocked. There was nothing that a beetle could have lunched upon. The pinched and meager aspect of the place would have killed a chameleon. He would have known, at the first mouthful, that the air was not eatable, and must have given up the ghost in despair. The small servant stood with humility in presence of Miss Sally, and hung her head. "Are you there?" said Miss Sally. "Yes, ma'am," was the answer in a weak voice. "Go further away from the leg of mutton, or you'll be picking it, I know," said Miss Sally. The girl withdrew into a corner, while Miss Brass took a key from her pocket, and opening the safe, brought from it a dreary waste of cold potatoes, looking as eatable as Stonehenge. This she placed before the small servant, ordering her to sit down before it, and then, taking up a great carving knife, made a mighty show of sharpening it upon the carving fork. "Do you see this?" said Miss Brass, slicing off about 2 square inches of cold mutton, after all this preparation, and holding it out on the point of the fork. The small servant looked hard enough at it with her hungry eyes to see every shred of it, small as it was, and answered, "Yes." "Then don't you ever go and say," retorted Miss Sally, "that you hadn't meat here. There, eat it up." This was soon done. "Now, do you want any more?" said Miss Sally. The hungry creature answered with a faint no. They were evidently going through an established form. "You've been helped once to meat," said Miss Brass, summing up the facts. "You have had as much as you can eat, you're asked if you want any more, and you answer, no. Then don't you ever go and say you were allowanced. Mind that." With those words, Miss Sally put the meat away and locked the safe, and then drawing near to the small servant, overlooked her while she finished the potatoes. It was plain that some extraordinary grudge was working in Miss Brass's gentle breast, and that it was that which impelled her, without the smallest present cause, to rap the child with the blade of the knife, now on her hand, now on her head, and now on her back, as if she found it quite impossible to stand so close to her without administering a few slight knocks. But Mr. Swiveller was not a little surprised to see his fellow clerk, after walking slowly backwards towards the door, as if she were trying to withdraw herself from the room but could not accomplish it, dart suddenly forward, and falling on the small servant, give her some hard blows with her clenched hand. The victim cried, but in a subdued manner as if she feared to raise her voice, and Miss Sally, comforting herself with a pinch of snuff, ascended the stairs, just as Richard had safely reached the office. Chapter 37. The single gentleman among his other peculiarities, and he had a very plentiful stock, of which he every day furnished some new specimen, took a most extraordinary and remarkable interest in the exhibition of Punch. If the sound of a Punch's voice, at ever so remote a distance, reached Bevis Marks, the single gentleman, though in bed and asleep, would start up, and, hurrying on his clothes, make for the spot with all speed, and presently return at the head of a long procession of idlers, having in the midst the theater and its proprietors. Straightway, the stage would be set up in front of Mr. Brass's house. The single gentleman would establish himself at the first-floor window, and the entertainment would proceed, with all its exciting accompaniments of fife and drum and shout, to the excessive consternation of all sober votaries of business in that silent thoroughfare. It might have been expected that when the play was done, both players and audience would have dispersed, but the epilogue was as bad as the play, for no sooner was the devil dead than the manager of the puppets and his partner were summoned by the single gentleman to his chamber, where they were regaled with strong waters from his private store, and where they held with him long conversations, the purport of which no human being could fathom. But the secret of these discussions was of little importance. It was sufficient to know that while they were proceeding, the concourse without still lingered round the house, that boys beat upon the drum with their fists and imitated Punch with their tender voices, that the office window was rendered opaque by flattened noses, and the keyhole of the street door luminous with eyes, that every time the single gentleman or either of his guests was seen at the upper window, or so much as the end of one of their noses was visible, there was a great shout of execration from the excluded mob, who remained howling and yelling and refusing consolation, until the exhibitors were delivered up to them to be attended elsewhere. It was sufficient, in short, to know that Bevis Marks was revolutionized by these popular movements, and that peace and quietness fled from its precincts. Nobody was rendered more indignant by these proceedings than Mr. Sampson Brass, who, as he could by no means afford to lose so profitable an inmate, deemed it prudent to pocket his lodger's affront along with his cash, and to annoy the audiences who clustered round his door by such imperfect means of retaliation as were open to him, and which were confined to the trickling down of foul water on their heads from unseen watering pots, pelting them with fragments of tile and mortar from the roof of the house, and bribing the drivers of hackney cabriolets to come suddenly round the corner and dash in among them precipitately. It may, at first sight, be matter of surprise to the thoughtless few that Mr. Brass, being a professional gentleman, should not have legally indicted some party or parties active in the promotion of the nuisance, but they will be good enough to remember that as doctors seldom take their own prescriptions and divines do not always practice what they preach, so lawyers are shy of meddling with the law on their own account, knowing it to be an edged tool of uncertain application, very expensive in the working, and rather remarkable for its properties of close shaving than for its always shaving the right person. "Come," said Mr. Brass one afternoon, "this is 2 days without a Punch. I'm in hopes he has run through 'em all at last." "Why are you in hopes?" returned Miss Sally. "What harm do they do?" "Here's a pretty sort of a fellow," cried Brass, laying down his pen in despair. "Now here's an aggravating animal." "Well, what harm do they do?" retorted Sally. "What harm?" cried Brass. "Is it no harm to have a constant hallooing and hooting under one's very nose, distracting one from business, and making one grind one's teeth with vexation? Is it no harm to be blinded and choked up, and have the king's highway stopped with a set of screamers and roarers whose throats must be made of brass?" suggested Mr. Swiveller. "Of brass," said the lawyer, glancing at his clerk, to assure himself that he had suggested the word in good faith and without any sinister intention. "Is that no harm?" The lawyer stopped short in his invective, and listening for a moment, and recognizing the well-known voice, rested his head upon his hand, raised his eyes to the ceiling, and muttered faintly, "There's another." Up went the single gentleman's window directly. "There's another," repeated Brass. "And if I could get a break and 4 blood horses to cut into the marks when the crowd is at its thickest, I'd give 18 pence and never grudge it." The distant squeak was heard again. The single gentleman's door burst open. He ran violently down the stairs, out into the street, and so past the window without any hat, towards the quarter whence the sound proceeded, bent, no doubt, upon securing the stranger's services directly. "I wish I only knew who his friends were," muttered Sampson, filling his pocket with papers. "If they'd just get up a pretty little commission de lunatico at the Gray's and Coffee House and give me the job, I'd be content to have the lodgings empty for one while, at all events." With which words, and knocking his hat over his eyes, as if for the purpose of shutting out even a glimpse of the dreadful visitation, Mr. Brass rushed from the house and hurried away. As Mr. Swiveller was decidedly favorable to these performances, upon the ground that looking at a punch, or indeed looking at anything out of window, was better than working, and as he had been, for this reason, at some pains to awaken in his fellow clerk a sense of their beauties and manifold deserts, both he and Miss Sally rose as with one accord and took up their positions at the window, upon the sill whereof, as in a post of honor, sundry young ladies and gentlemen who were employed in the dry nurture of babies, and who made a point of being present with their young charges on such occasions, had already established themselves as comfortably as the circumstances would allow. The glass being dim, Mr. Swiveller, agreeably to a friendly custom which he had established between them, hitched off the brown headdress from Miss Sally's head, and dusted it carefully therewith. By the time he had handed it back, and its beautiful wearer had put it on again, which she did with perfect composure and indifference, the lodger returned with the show and showman at his heels, and a strong addition to the body of spectators. The exhibitor disappeared with all speed behind the drapery, and his partner, stationing himself by the side of the theatre, surveyed the audience with a remarkable expression of melancholy, which became more remarkable still when he breathed a hornpipe tune into that sweet musical instrument which is popularly termed a mouth-organ, without at all changing the mournful expression of the upper part of his face, though his mouth and chin were, of necessity, in lively spasms. The drama proceeded to its close, and held the spectators enchained in the customary manner. The sensation which kindles in large assemblies, when they are relieved from a state of breathless suspense and are again free to speak and move, was yet rife, when the lodger, as usual, summoned the men upstairs. "Both of you," he called from the window, for only the actual exhibitor, a little fat man, prepared to obey the summons. "I want to talk to you. Come, both of you." "Come, Tommy," said the little man. "I ain't a talker," replied the other. "Tell him so. What should I go and talk for?" "Don't you see the gentleman's got a bottle and glass up there?" returned the little man. "And couldn't you have said so at first?" retorted the other with sudden alacrity. "Now, what are you waiting for? Are you going to keep the gentleman expecting us all day? Haven't you no manners?" With this remonstrance, the melancholy man, who was no other than Mr. Thomas Codlin, pushed past his friend and brother in the craft, Mr. Harris, otherwise Short or Trotters, and hurried before him to the single gentleman's apartment. "Now, my men," said the single gentleman, "you have done very well. What will you take? Tell that little man behind to shut the door." "Shut the door, can't you?" said Mr. Codlin, turning gruffly to his friend. "You might have knowed that the gentleman wanted the door shut, without being told, I think." Mr. Short obeyed, observing under his breath that his friend seemed unusually cranky, and expressing a hope that there was no dairy in the neighborhood, or his temper would certainly spoil its contents. The gentleman pointed to a couple of chairs, and intimated by an emphatic nod of his head that he expected them to be seated. Messrs. Codlin and Short, after looking at each other with considerable doubt and indecision, at length sat down, each on the extreme edge of the chair pointed out to him, and held their hats very tight, while the single gentleman filled a couple of glasses from a bottle on the table beside him, and presented them in due form. "You're pretty well browned by the sun, both of you," said their entertainer. "Have you been traveling?" Mr. Short replied in the affirmative with a nod and a smile. Mr. Codlin added a corroborative nod and a short groan, as if he still felt the weight of the temple on his shoulders. "To fairs, markets, races, and so forth, I suppose?" pursued the single gentleman. "Yes, sir," returned Short, "pretty nigh all over the west of England." I have talked to men of your craft from north, east, and south, returned their host in rather a hasty manner, but I never lighted on any from the west before. It's our Reglar summer circuit is the west, master, said Short. That's where it is. We takes the east of London in the spring and winter, and the west of England in the summertime. Many's the hard days walking in rain and mud, and with never a penny earned, we've had down in the west. Let me fill your glass again. Much obliged to you, sir. I think I will, said Mr. Codlin, suddenly thrusting in his own and turning Short's aside. I'm the sufferer, sir, in all the traveling and in all the staying at home. In town or country, wet or dry, hot or cold, Tom Codlin suffers. But Tom Codlin isn't to complain for all that. Oh, no. Short may complain, but if Codlin grumbles by so much as a word, oh dear, down with him directly. It isn't his place to grumble. That's quite out of the question. Codlin ain't without his usefulness, observed Short with an arch look, but he don't always keep his eyes open. He falls asleep sometimes, you know. Remember them last races, Tommy? Will you never leave off aggravating a man? Said Codlin. It's very like I was asleep when 5 and 10pence was collected, in one round, isn't it? I was attending to my business, and couldn't have my eyes in 20 places at once, like a peacock, no more than you could. If I ain't a match for an old man and a young child, you ain't neither, so don't throw that out against me. For the cap fits your head quite as correct as it fits mine. You may as well drop the subject, Tom, said Short. It isn't particular agreeable to the gentleman, I dare say. Then you shouldn't have brought it up, returned Mr. Codlin. And I ask the gentleman's pardon on your account, as a giddy chap that likes to hear himself talk, and don't much care what he talks about, so that he does talk. Their entertainer had sat perfectly quiet in the beginning of this dispute, looking first at one man and then at the other, as if he were lying in wait for an opportunity of putting some further question, or reverting to that from which the discourse had strayed. But, from the point where Mr. Codlin was charged with sleepiness, he had shown an increasing interest in the discussion, which now attained a very high pitch. You are the 2 men I want, he said, the 2 men I have been looking for and searching after. Where are that old man and that child you speak of? Sir, said Short, hesitating and looking towards his friend. The old man and his grandchild who traveled with you. Where are they? It will be worth your while to speak out, I assure you. Much better worth your while than you believe. They left you, you say, at those races, as I understand. They have been traced to that place, and they're lost sight of. Have you no clue? Can you suggest no clue to their recovery? Did I always say, Thomas, cried Short, turning with a look of amazement to his friend, that there was sure to be an inquiry after them 2 travelers? You said, returned Mr. Codlin. Did I always say that that blessed child was the most interesting I ever see? Did I always say I loved her and dote on her? Pretty creetur, I think I hear her now. Codlin's my friend, she says, with a tear of gratitude a-trickling down her little eye. Codlin's my friend, she says, not Short. Short's very well, she says. I've no quarrel with Short. He means kind, I dare say. But Codlin, she says, has the feelings for my money, though he mayn't look it. Repeating these words with great emotion, Mr. Codlin rubbed the bridge of his nose with his coat sleeve, and shaking his head mournfully from side to side, left the single gentleman to infer that, from the moment when he lost sight of his dear young charge, his peace of mind and happiness had fled. Good heaven, said the single gentleman, pacing up and down the room, have I found these men at last, only to discover that they can give me no information or assistance. It would have been better to have lived on, in hope, from day to day, and never to have lighted on them, than to have my expectations scattered thus. Stay a minute, said Short. A man of the name of Jerry. You know Jerry, Thomas? Oh, don't talk to me of Jerry's, replied Mr. Codlin. How can I care a pinch of snuff for Jerry's, when I think of that darling child? Codlin's my friend, she says, dear, good, kind Codlin, as is always a devising pleasures for me. I don't object to Short, she says, but I cotton to Codlin. Once, said that gentleman reflectively, she called me Father Codlin. I thought I should have bust. A man of the name of Jerry, sir, said Short, turning from his selfish colleague to their new acquaintance. What keeps a company of dancing dogs, told me, in an accidental sort of way, that he had seen the old gentleman in connection with a traveling waxwork, unbeknown to him, as they'd given us the slip, and nothing had come of it, and this was down in the country that he'd been seen. I took no measures about it, and asked no questions, but I can, if you like. Is this man in town? Said the impatient single gentleman. Speak faster. No, he isn't, but he will be tomorrow, for he lodges in our house, replied Mr. Short rapidly. Then bring him here, said the single gentleman. Here's a sovereign apiece. If I can find these people through your means, it is but a prelude to 20 more. Return to me tomorrow, and keep your own counsel on this subject, though I need hardly tell you that, for you'll do so for your own sakes. Now, give me your address, and leave me. The address was given, the two men departed, the crowd went with them, and the single gentleman for 2 mortal hours walked in uncommon agitation up and down his room, over the wondering heads of Mr. Swiveller and Miss Sally Brass. Chapter 38. Kit, for it happens at this juncture, not only that we have breathing time to follow his fortunes, but that the necessities of these adventures so adapt themselves to our ease and inclination as to call upon us imperatively to pursue the track we most desire to take. Kit, while the matters treated of in the last 15 chapters were yet in progress, was, as the reader may suppose, gradually familiarizing himself more and more with Mr. and Mrs. Garland, Mr. Abel, the pony, and Barbara, and gradually coming to consider them one and all as his particular private friends, and Abel Cottage, Finchley, as his own proper home. Stay. The words are written and may go, but if they convey any notion that Kit, in the plentiful board and comfortable lodging of his new abode, began to think slightingly of the poor fare and furniture of his old dwelling, they do their office badly and commit injustice. Who so mindful of those he left at home, albeit they were but a mother and 2 young babies, as Kit? What boastful father in the fullness of his heart ever related such wonders of his infant prodigy, as Kit never wearied of telling Barbara in the evening time, concerning little Jacob? Was there ever such a mother as Kit's mother on her son's showing? Or was there ever such comfort in poverty as in the poverty of Kit's family, if any correct judgment might be arrived at from his own glowing account? And let me linger in this place, for an instant, to remark that if ever household affections and loves are graceful things, they are graceful in the poor. The ties that bind the wealthy and the proud to home may be forged on earth, but those which link the poor man to his humble hearth are of the truer metal and bear the stamp of heaven. The man of high descent may love the halls and lands of his inheritance as part of himself, as trophies of his birth and power. His associations with them are associations of pride and wealth and triumph. The poor man's attachment to the tenements he holds, which strangers have held before and may tomorrow occupy again, has a worthier root, struck deep into a purer soil. His household gods are of flesh and blood, with no alloy of silver, gold, or precious stone. He has no property but in the affections of his own heart, and when they endear bare floors and walls, despite of rags and toil and scanty fare, that man has his love of home from God, and his rude hut becomes a solemn place. Oh, if those who rule the destinies of nations would but remember this, if they would but think how hard it is for the very poor to have engendered in their hearts that love of home from which all domestic virtues spring, when they live in dense and squalid masses where social decency is lost, or rather never found, if they would but turn aside from the wide thoroughfares and great houses, and strive to improve the wretched dwellings in byways where only poverty may walk, many low roofs would point more truly to the sky than the loftiest steeple that now rears proudly up from the midst of guilt and crime and horrible disease, to mock them by its contrast. in hollow voices from workhouse, hospital, and jail. This truth is preached from day to day and has been proclaimed for years. It is no light matter, no outcry from the working vulgar, no mere question of the people's health and comforts that may be whistled down on Wednesday nights. In love of home, the love of country has its rise. And who are the truer patriots or the better in time of need? Those who venerate the land, owning its wood and stream and earth and all that they produce? Or those who love their country, boasting not a foot of ground in all its wide domain? Kit knew nothing about such questions, but he knew that his old home was a very poor place, and that his new one was very unlike it, and yet he was constantly looking back with grateful satisfaction and affectionate anxiety, and often indited square-folded letters to his mother, enclosing a shilling or 18 pence or such other small remittance, which Mr. Abel's liberality enabled him to make. Sometimes being in the neighborhood, he had leisure to call upon her, and then great was the joy and pride of Kit's mother, and extremely noisy the satisfaction of little Jacob and the baby, and cordial the congratulations of the whole court, who listened with admiring ears to the accounts of Abel Cottage, and could never be told too much of its wonders and magnificence. Although Kit was in the very highest favor with the old lady and gentleman, and Mr. Abel and Barbara, it is certain that no member of the family evinced such a remarkable partiality for him as the self-willed pony, who, from being the most obstinate and opinionated pony on the face of the earth, was, in his hands, the meekest and most tractable of animals. It is true that in exact proportion as he became manageable by Kit, he became utterly ungovernable by anybody else, as if he had determined to keep him in the family at all risks and hazards, and that, even under the guidance of his favorite, he would sometimes perform a great variety of strange freaks and capers, to the extreme discomposure of the old lady's nerves. But as Kit always represented that this was only his fun, or a way he had of showing his attachment to his employers, Mrs. Garland gradually suffered herself to be persuaded into the belief, in which she at last became so strongly confirmed, that if, in one of these ebullitions, he had overturned the chaise, she would have been quite satisfied that he did it with the very best intentions. Besides becoming in a short time a perfect marvel in all stable matters, Kit soon made himself a very tolerable gardener, a handy fellow within doors, and an indispensable attendant on Mr. Abel, who every day gave him some new proof of his confidence and approbation. Mr. Witherden the notary, too, regarded him with a friendly eye, and even Mr. Chuckster would sometimes condescend to give him a slight nod, or to honor him with that peculiar form of recognition which is called taking a sight, or to favor him with some other salute combining pleasantry with patronage. One morning Kit drove Mr. Abel to the notary's office, as he sometimes did, and having set him down at the house, was about to drive off to a livery stable hard by, when this same Mr. Chuckster emerged from the office door, and cried, "W.R.A." dwelling upon the note a long time, for the purpose of striking terror into the pony's heart, and asserting the supremacy of man over the inferior animals. "Pull up, Snobby," cried Mr. Chuckster, addressing himself to Kit. "You're wanted inside here." "Has Mr. Abel forgotten anything, I wonder?" said Kit as he dismounted. "Ask no questions, Snobby," returned Mr. Chuckster, "but go and see. W.A.I. then, will you? If that pony was mine, I'd break him." "You must be very gentle with him, if you please," said Kit, "or you'll find him troublesome. You'd better not keep on pulling his ears, please. I know he won't like it." To this remonstrance Mr. Chuckster deigned no other answer than addressing Kit with a lofty and distant air as "young feller," and requesting him to cut and come again with all speed. The young feller complying, Mr. Chuckster put his hands in his pockets, and tried to look as if he were not minding the pony, but happened to be lounging there by accident. Kit scraped his shoes very carefully, for he had not yet lost his reverence for the bundles of papers and the tin boxes, and tapped at the office door, which was quickly opened by the notary himself. "Oh, come in, Christopher," said Mr. Witherden. "Is that the lad?" asked an elderly gentleman, but of a stout, bluff figure, who was in the room. "That's the lad," said Mr. Witherden. "He fell in with my client, Mr. Garland, sir, at this very door. I have reason to think he is a good lad, sir, and that you may believe what he says. Let me introduce Mr. Abel Garland, sir, his young master. My articled pupil, sir, and most particular friend." "My most particular friend, sir," repeated the notary, drawing out his silk handkerchief and flourishing it about his face. "Your servant, sir," said the stranger gentleman. "Yours, sir, I'm sure," replied Mr. Abel mildly. "You were wishing to speak to Christopher, sir?" "Yes, I was. Have I your permission?" "By all means. My business is no secret, or I should rather say it need be no secret here," said the stranger, observing that Mr. Abel and the notary were preparing to retire. "It relates to a dealer in curiosities with whom he lived, and in whom I am earnestly and warmly interested. I have been a stranger to this country, gentlemen, for very many years, and if I am deficient in form and ceremony, I hope you will forgive me." "No forgiveness is necessary, sir. None whatever," replied the notary. And so said Mr. Abel. "I have been making inquiries in the neighborhood in which his old master lived," said the stranger, "and I learned that he was served by this lad. I have found out his mother's house, and have been directed by her to this place as the nearest in which I should be likely to find him. That's the cause of my presenting myself here this morning." "I am very glad of any cause, sir," said the notary, "which procures me the honor of this visit." "Sir," retorted the stranger, "you speak like a mere man of the world, and I think you something better. Therefore, pray do not sink your real character in paying unmeaning compliments to me." "Him," coughed the notary, "you're a plain speaker, sir." "And a plain dealer," returned the stranger. "It may be my long absence and inexperience that lead me to the conclusion, but if plain speakers are scarce in this part of the world, I fancy plain dealers are still scarcer. If my speaking should offend you, sir, my dealing, I hope, will make amends." Mr. Witherden seemed a little disconcerted by the elderly gentleman's mode of conducting the dialogue, and as for Kit, he looked at him in open-mouthed astonishment, wondering what kind of language he would address to him if he talked in that free and easy way to a notary. It was with no harshness, however, though with something of constitutional irritability and haste, that he turned to Kit and said, "If you think, my lad, that I am pursuing these inquiries with any other view than that of serving and reclaiming those I am in search of, you do me a very great wrong and deceive yourself. Don't be deceived, I beg of you, but rely upon my assurance. The fact is, gentlemen," he added, turning again to the notary and his pupil, "that I am in a very painful and wholly unexpected position. I came to this city with a darling object at my heart, expecting to find no obstacle or difficulty in the way of its attainment. I find myself suddenly checked and stopped short, in the execution of my design, by a mystery which I cannot penetrate. Every effort I have made to penetrate it has only served to render it darker and more obscure, and I am afraid to stir openly in the matter, lest those whom I anxiously pursue should fly still farther from me. I assure you that if you could give me any assistance, you would not be sorry to do so, if you knew how greatly I stand in need of it, and what a load it would relieve me from." There was a simplicity in this confidence which occasioned it to find a quick response in the breast of the good-natured notary, who replied in the same spirit that the stranger had not mistaken his desire, and that if he could be of service to him, he would, most readily. Kit was then put under examination and closely questioned by the unknown gentleman, touching his old master and the child, their lonely way of life, their retired habits, and strict seclusion, the nightly absence of the old man, the solitary existence of the child at those times, his illness and recovery, Quilp's possession of the house, and their sudden disappearance, were all the subjects of much questioning and answer. Finally, Kit informed the gentleman that the premises were now to let, and that a board upon the door referred all inquirers to Mr. Sampson Brass, solicitor, of Bevis Marks, from whom he might perhaps learn some further particulars. "Not by inquiry," said the gentleman, shaking his head. "I live there." "Live at Brass's the attorneys," cried Mr. Witherden in some surprise. Having professional knowledge of the gentleman in question, "Aye," was the reply. "I entered on his lodgings t'other day, chiefly because I had seen this very board. It matters little to me where I live, and I had a desperate hope that some intelligence might be cast in my way there, which would not reach me elsewhere. Yes, I live at Brass's. More shame for me, I suppose?" "That's a mere matter of opinion," said the notary, shrugging his shoulders. "He is looked upon as rather a doubtful character." "Doubtful?" echoed the other. "I am glad to hear there's any doubt about it. I suppose that had been thoroughly settled long ago. But will you let me speak a word or two with you in private?" Mr. Witherden consenting, they walked into that gentleman's private closet and remained there in close conversation for some quarter of an hour, when they returned into the outer office. The stranger had left his hat in Mr. Witherden's room and seemed to have established himself in this short interval on quite a friendly footing. "I'll not detain you any longer now," he said, putting a crown into Kit's hand and looking towards the notary. "You shall hear from me again. Not a word of this, you know, except to your master and mistress." "Mother, sir, would be glad to know," said Kit, faltering. "Glad to know what?" "Anything, so that it was no harm about Miss Nell." "Would she? Well then, you may tell her if she can keep a secret. But mind, not a word of this to anybody else. Don't forget that. Be particular." "I'll take care, sir," said Kit. "Thank'ee, sir, and good morning." Now, it happened that the gentleman, in his anxiety to impress upon Kit that he was not to tell anybody what had passed between them, followed him out to the door to repeat his caution, and it further happened that at that moment the eyes of Mr. Richard Swiveller were turned in that direction, and beheld his mysterious friend and Kit together. It was quite an accident, and the way in which it came about was this. Mr. Chuckster, being a gentleman of a cultivated taste and refined spirit, was one of that lodge of glorious Apollos whereof Mr. Swiveller was perpetual grand. Mr. Swiveller, passing through the street in the execution of some brazen errand, and beholding one of his glorious brotherhood intently gazing on a pony, crossed over to give him that fraternal greeting with which perpetual grands are, by the very constitution of their office, bound to cheer and encourage their disciples. He had scarcely bestowed upon him his blessing, and followed it with a general remark touching the present state and prospects of the weather, when, lifting up his eyes, he beheld the single gentleman of Bevis Marks in earnest conversation with Christopher Nubbles. "Hullo," said Dick. "Who is that?" "He called to see my governor this morning," replied Mr. Chuckster. "Beyond that, I don't know him from Adam." "At least you know his name?" said Dick. To which Mr. Chuckster replied, with an elevation of speech becoming a glorious Apollo, that he was everlastingly blessed if he did. "All I know, my dear feller," said Mr. Chuckster, running his fingers through his hair, "is that he is the cause of my having stood here 20 minutes, for which I hate him with a mortal and undying hatred, and would pursue him to the confines of eternity if I could afford the time." While they were thus discoursing, the subject of their conversation, who had not appeared to recognize Mr. Richard Swiveller, re-entered the house, and Kit came down the steps and joined them, to whom Mr. Swiveller again propounded his inquiry with no better success. "He is a very nice gentleman, sir," said Kit, "and that's all I know about him." Mr. Chuckster waxed wroth at this answer, and without applying the remark to any particular case, mentioned, as a general truth, that it was expedient to break the heads of snobs and to tweak their noses. Without expressing his concurrence in this sentiment, Mr. Swiveller, after a few moments of abstraction, inquired which way Kit was driving, and, being informed, declared it was his way, and that he would trespass on him for a lift. Kit would gladly have declined the proffered honor, but as Mr. Swiveller was already established in the seat beside him, he had no means of doing so, otherwise than by a forcible ejectment, and therefore drove briskly off. So briskly, indeed, as to cut short the leave-taking between Mr. Chuckster and his grand master, and to occasion the former gentleman some inconvenience from having his corns squeezed by the impatient pony. As Whisker was tired of standing, and Mr. Swiveller was kind enough to stimulate him by shrill whistles and various sporting cries, they rattled off at too sharp a pace to admit of much conversation. Especially as the pony, incensed by Mr. Swiveller's admonitions, took a particular fancy for the lamp-posts and cartwheels, and evinced a strong desire to run on the pavement and rasp himself against the brick walls. It was not, therefore, until they had arrived at the stable, and the chaise had been extricated from a very small doorway, into which the pony dragged it under the impression that he could take it along with him into his usual stall, that Mr. Swiveller found time to talk. "It's hard work," said Richard. "What do you say to some beer?" Kit at first declined, but presently consented, and they adjourned to the neighboring bar together. "We'll drink our friend What's his name," said Dick, holding up the bright frothy pot. "That was talking to you this morning, you know. I know him, a good fellow, but eccentric, very. Here's What's his name." Kit pledged him. "He lives in my house," said Dick. "At least in the house occupied by the firm in which I'm a sort of a managing partner. A difficult fellow to get anything out of, but we like him. "I must be going, sir, if you please," said Kit, moving away. "Don't be in a hurry, Christopher," replied his patron. "We'll drink your mother." "Thank you, sir." "An excellent woman, that mother of yours, Christopher," said Mr. Swiveller, "who ran to catch me when I fell, and kissed the place to make it well. My mother. A charming woman. He's a liberal sort of fellow. We must get him to do something for your mother. Does he know her, Christopher?" Kit shook his head, and glancing slyly at his questioner, thanked him, and made off before he could say another word. "Humph," said Mr. Swiveller, pondering. "This is queer. Nothing but mysteries in connection with Brass's house. I'll keep my own counsel, however. Everybody and anybody has been in my confidence as yet, but now I think I'll set up in business for myself. Queer, very queer." After pondering deeply and with a face of exceeding wisdom for some time, Mr. Swiveller drank some more of the beer, and summoning a small boy who had been watching his proceedings, poured forth the few remaining drops as a libation on the gravel, and bade him carry the empty vessel to the bar with his compliments, and above all things to lead a sober and temperate life, and abstain from all intoxicating and exciting liquors. Having given him this piece of moral advice for his trouble, which, as he wisely observed, was far better than halfpence, the perpetual Grand Master of the glorious Apollos thrust his hands into his pockets and sauntered away, still pondering as he went. Chapter 39. All that day, though he waited for Mr. Abel until evening, Kit kept clear of his mother's house, determined not to anticipate the pleasures of the morrow, but to let them come in their full rush of delight. For tomorrow was the great and long-looked-for epoch in his life. Tomorrow was the end of his first quarter, the day of receiving, for the first time, 1/4 part of his annual income of £6 in one vast sum of 30 shillings. Tomorrow was to be a half-holiday devoted to a whirl of entertainments, and little Jacob was to know what oysters meant, and to see a play. All manner of incidents combined in favor of the occasion. Not only had Mr. and Mrs. Garland forewarned him that they intended to make no deduction for his outfit from the great amount, but to pay it him unbroken in all its gigantic grandeur. Not only had the unknown gentleman increased the stock by the sum of 5 shillings, which was a perfect godsend and in itself a fortune. Not only had these things come to pass which nobody could have calculated upon, or in their wildest dreams have hoped, but it was Barbara's quarter too, Barbara's quarter, that very day, and Barbara had a half-holiday as well as Kit, and Barbara's mother was going to make one of the party, and to take tea with Kit's mother and cultivate her acquaintance. To be sure, Kit looked out of his window very early that morning to see which way the clouds were flying, and to be sure Barbara would have been at hers too, if she had not sat up so late overnight, starching and ironing small pieces of muslin, and crimping them into frills, and sewing them on to other pieces to form magnificent holes for next day's wear. But they were both up very early for all that, and had small appetites for breakfast and less for dinner, and were in a state of great excitement when Barbara's mother came in, with astonishing accounts of the fineness of the weather out of doors, but with a very large umbrella notwithstanding, for people like Barbara's mother seldom make holiday without one. And when the bell rang for them to go upstairs and receive their quarter's money in gold and silver, well, wasn't Mr. Garland kind when he said, "Christopher, here's your money, and you have earned it well"? And wasn't Mrs. Garland kind when she said, "Barbara, here's yours, and I'm much pleased with you"? And didn't Kit sign his name bold to his receipt? And didn't Barbara sign her name all a-trembling to hers? And wasn't it beautiful to see how Mrs. Garland poured out Barbara's mother a glass of wine? And didn't Barbara's mother speak up when she said, "Here's blessing you, ma'am, as a good lady, and you, sir, as a good gentleman, and Barbara, my love to you, and here's towards you, Mr. Christopher"? And wasn't she as long drinking it as if it had been a tumblerful? And didn't she look genteel, standing there with her gloves on? And wasn't there plenty of laughing and talking among them as they reviewed all these things upon the top of the coach? And didn't they pity the people who hadn't got a holiday? But Kit's mother again. Wouldn't anybody have supposed she had come of a good stock and been a lady all her life? There she was, quite ready to receive them, with a display of tea things that might have warmed the heart of a china shop, and little Jacob and the baby in such a state of perfection that their clothes looked as good as new, though heaven knows they were old enough. Didn't she say before they had sat down 5 minutes that Barbara's mother was exactly the sort of lady she expected? And didn't Barbara's mother say that Kit's mother was the very picture of what she had expected? And didn't Kit's mother compliment Barbara's mother on Barbara? And didn't Barbara's mother compliment Kit's mother on Kit? And wasn't Barbara herself quite fascinated with little Jacob? And did ever a child show off when he was wanted, as that child did, or make such friends as he made? "And we are both widows too," said Barbara's mother. "We must have been made to know each other." "I haven't a doubt about it," returned Mrs. Nubbles. "And what a pity it is we didn't know each other sooner. But then, you know, it's such a pleasure," said Barbara's mother, "to have it brought about by one's son and daughter, that it's fully made up for. Now, ain't it?" To this, Kit's mother yielded her full assent, and tracing things back from effects to causes, they naturally reverted to their deceased husbands, respecting whose lives, deaths, and burials they compared notes and discovered sundry circumstances that tallied with wonderful exactness, such as Barbara's father having been exactly 4 years and 10 months older than Kit's father, and one of them having died on a Wednesday and the other on a Thursday, and both of them having been of a very fine make and remarkably good-looking, with other extraordinary coincidences. These recollections being of a kind calculated to cast a shadow on the brightness of the holiday, Kit diverted the conversation to general topics, and they were soon in great force again, and as merry as before. Among other things, Kit told them about his old place, and the extraordinary beauty of Nell, of whom he had talked to Barbara 1,000 times already. But the last-named circumstance failed to interest his hearers to anything like the extent he had supposed, and even his mother said, looking accidentally at Barbara at the same time, that there was no doubt Miss Nell was very pretty, but she was but a child after all, and there were many young women quite as pretty as she, and Barbara mildly observed that she should think so, and that she never could help believing Mr. Christopher must be under a mistake, which Kit wondered at very much, not being able to conceive what reason she had for doubting him. Barbara's mother, too, observed that it was very common for young folks to change at about 14 or 15, and whereas they had been very pretty before, to grow up quite plain, which truth she illustrated by many forcible examples, especially one of a young man, who, being a builder with great prospects, had been particular in his attentions to Barbara, but whom Barbara would have nothing to say to, which, though everything happened for the best, she almost thought was a pity. Kit said he thought so too, and so he did honestly, and he wondered what made Barbara so silent all at once, and why his mother looked at him as if he shouldn't have said it. However, it was high time now to be thinking of the play, for which great preparation was required, in the way of shawls and bonnets, not to mention one handkerchief full of oranges and another of apples, which took some time tying up, in consequence of the fruit having a tendency to roll out at the corners. At length, everything was ready, and they went off very fast, Kit's mother carrying the baby, who was dreadfully wide awake, and Kit holding little Jacob in one hand, and escorting Barbara with the other. a state of things which occasioned the two mothers, who walked behind, to declare that they looked quite family folks, and caused Barbara to blush and say, "Now don't, mother." But Kit said she had no call to mind what they said, and indeed she need not have had, if she had known how very far from Kit's thoughts any lovemaking was. Poor Barbara! At last they got to the theater, which was Astley's, and in some 2 minutes after they had reached the yet unopened door, little Jacob was squeezed flat, and the baby had received divers concussions, and Barbara's mother's umbrella had been carried several yards off and passed back to her over the shoulders of the people, and Kit had hit a man on the head with the handkerchief of apples for scourging his parent with unnecessary violence, and there was a great uproar. But when they were once past the pay place and tearing away for very life with their checks in their hands, and above all, when they were fairly in the theater, and seated in such places that they couldn't have had better if they had picked them out and taken them beforehand, all this was looked upon as quite a capital joke and an essential part of the entertainment. Dear, dear, what a place it looked, that Astley's, with all the paint, gilding, and looking-glass, the vague smell of horses suggestive of coming wonders, the curtain that hid such gorgeous mysteries, the clean white sawdust down in the circus, the company coming in and taking their places, the fiddlers looking carelessly up at them while they tuned their instruments, as if they didn't want the play to begin and knew it all beforehand. What a glow was that which burst upon them all, when that long, clear, brilliant row of lights came slowly up, and what the feverish excitement when the little bell rang and the music began in good earnest, with strong parts for the drums and sweet effects for the triangles. Well might Barbara's mother say to Kit's mother that the gallery was the place to see from, and wonder it wasn't much dearer than the boxes. Well might Barbara feel doubtful whether to laugh or cry, in her flutter of delight. Then the play itself, the horses which little Jacob believed from the first to be alive, and the ladies and gentlemen of whose reality he could be by no means persuaded, having never seen or heard anything at all like them. The firing, which made Barbara wink, the forlorn lady, who made her cry, the tyrant, who made her tremble, the man who sang the song with the lady's maid and danced the chorus, who made her laugh, the pony who reared up on his hind legs when he saw the murderer, and wouldn't hear of walking on all fours again until he was taken into custody, the clown who ventured on such familiarities with the military man in boots, the lady who jumped over the 29 ribbons and came down safe upon the horse's back. Everything was delightful, splendid, and surprising. Little Jacob applauded till his hands were sore. Kit cried, encore at the end of everything, the 3-act piece included. And Barbara's mother beat her umbrella on the floor, in her ecstasies, until it was nearly worn down to the gingham. In the midst of all these fascinations, Barbara's thoughts seemed to have been still running on what Kit had said at tea-time. For, when they were coming out of the play, she asked him, with an hysterical simper, if Miss Nell was as handsome as the lady who jumped over the ribbons. "As handsome as her," said Kit. "Double as handsome." "Oh, Christopher, I'm sure she was the beautifulest creature ever was," said Barbara. "Nonsense," returned Kit. "She was well enough. I don't deny that. But think how she was dressed and painted, and what a difference that made. Why, you are a good deal better looking than her, Barbara." "Oh, Christopher," said Barbara, looking down. "You are, any day," said Kit, "and so's your mother." Poor Barbara! What was all this, though? Even all this, to the extraordinary dissipation that ensued, when Kit, walking into an oyster shop as bold as if he lived there, and not so much as looking at the counter or the man behind it, led his party into a box, a private box, fitted up with red curtains, white tablecloth, and cruet stand complete, and ordered a fierce gentleman with whiskers, who acted as waiter and called him Christopher Nubbles, sir, to bring 3 dozen of his largest-sized oysters and to look sharp about it. Yes, Kit told this gentleman to look sharp, and he not only said he would look sharp, but he actually did, and presently came running back with the newest loaves, and the freshest butter, and the largest oysters ever seen. Then said Kit to this gentleman, "A pot of beer." "Just so." And the gentleman, instead of replying, "Sir," did you address that language to me?" "Only said, 'Pot o' beer, sir?'" "Yes, sir," and went off and fetched it and put it on the table in a small decanter stand, like those which blind men's dogs carry about the streets in their mouths to catch the halfpence in. And both Kit's mother and Barbara's mother declared as he turned away that he was one of the slimmest and gracefulest young men she had ever looked upon. Then they fell to work upon the supper in earnest, and there was Barbara, that foolish Barbara, declaring that she could not eat more than 2, and wanting more pressing than you would believe before she would eat 4. Though her mother and Kit's mother made up for it pretty well, and ate and laughed and enjoyed themselves so thoroughly that it did Kit good to see them, and made him laugh and eat likewise from strong sympathy. But the greatest miracle of the night was little Jacob, who ate oysters as if he had been born and bred to the business, sprinkled the pepper and the vinegar with a discretion beyond his years, and afterwards built a grotto on the table with the shells. There was the baby, too, who had never closed an eye all night, but had sat as good as gold, trying to force a large orange into his mouth and gazing intently at the lights in the chandelier. There he was, sitting up in his mother's lap, staring at the gas without winking, and making indentations in his soft visage with an oyster shell, to that degree that a heart of iron must have loved him. In short, there never was a more successful supper. And when Kit ordered in a glass of something hot to finish with, and proposed Mr. and Mrs. Garland before sending it round, there were not 6 happier people in all the world. But all happiness has an end. Hence the chief pleasure of its next beginning, and as it was now growing late, they agreed it was time to turn their faces homewards. So, after going a little out of their way to see Barbara and Barbara's mother safe to a friend's house where they were to pass the night, Kit and his mother left them at the door, with an early appointment for returning to Finchley next morning, and a great many plans for next quarter's enjoyment. Then, Kit took little Jacob on his back, and giving his arm to his mother, and a kiss to the baby, they all trudged merrily home together. Chapter 40. Full of that vague kind of penitence which holidays awaken next morning, Kit turned out at sunrise, and with his faith in last night's enjoyments a little shaken by cool daylight and the return to everyday duties and occupations, went to meet Barbara and her mother at the appointed place. And being careful not to awaken any of the little household, who were yet resting from their unusual fatigues, Kit left his money on the chimney-piece, with an inscription in chalk calling his mother's attention to the circumstance and informing her that it came from her dutiful son, and went his way, with a heart something heavier than his pockets, but free from any very great oppression notwithstanding. Oh, these holidays! Why will they leave us some regret? Why cannot we push them back, only a week or 2 in our memories, so as to put them at once at that convenient distance whence they may be regarded either with a calm indifference or a pleasant effort of recollection? Why will they hang about us, like the flavor of yesterday's wine, suggestive of headaches and lassitude, and those good intentions for the future, which, under the earth, form the everlasting pavement of a large estate, and upon it usually endure until dinner-time or thereabouts? Who will wonder that Barbara had a headache, or that Barbara's mother was disposed to be cross, or that she slightly underrated Astley's, and thought the clown was older than they had taken him to be last night? Kit was not surprised to hear her say so. Not he. He had already had a misgiving that the inconstant actors in that dazzling vision had been doing the same thing the night before last, and would do it again that night, and the next, and for weeks and months to come, though he would not be there. Such is the difference between yesterday and today. We are all going to the play, or coming home from it. However, the sun himself is weak when he first rises, and gathers strength and courage as the day gets on. By degrees, they began to recall circumstances more and more pleasant in their nature, until, what between talking, walking, and laughing, they reached Finchley in such good heart that Barbara's mother declared she never felt less tired or in better spirits. And so said Kit. Barbara had been silent all the way, but she said so too. Poor little Barbara! She was very quiet. They were at home in such good time that Kit had rubbed down the pony and made him as spruce as a racehorse before Mr. Garland came down to breakfast, which punctual and industrious conduct the old lady and the old gentleman and Mr. Abel, highly extolled. At his usual hour, or rather at his usual minute and second, for he was the soul of punctuality, Mr. Abel walked out, to be overtaken by the London coach, and Kit and the old gentleman went to work in the garden. This was not the least pleasant of Kit's employments. On a fine day they were quite a family party. The old lady sitting hard by with her work-basket on a little table, the old gentleman digging, or pruning, or clipping about with a large pair of shears, or helping Kit in some way or other with great assiduity, and Whisker looking on from his paddock in placid contemplation of them all. Today they were to trim the grapevine. So Kit mounted halfway up a short ladder, and began to snip and hammer away, while the old gentleman, with a great interest in his proceedings, handed up the nails and shreds of cloth as he wanted them. The old lady and Whisker looked on as usual. "Well, Christopher," said Mr. Garland, "and so you have made a new friend, eh?" "I beg your pardon, sir," returned Kit, looking down from the ladder. "You have made a new friend, I hear from Mr. Abel," said the old gentleman, "at the office." "Oh, yes, sir, yes. He behaved very handsome, sir." "I'm glad to hear it," returned the old gentleman with a smile. "He is disposed to behave more handsomely still, though, Christopher." "Indeed, sir. It's very kind in him, but I don't want him to, I'm sure," said Kit, hammering stoutly at an obdurate nail. "He is rather anxious," pursued the old gentleman, "to have you in his own service. Take care what you're doing, or you will fall down and hurt yourself." "To have me in his service, sir?" cried Kit, who had stopped short in his work and faced about on the ladder like some dexterous tumbler. "Why, sir, I don't think he can be in earnest when he says that." "Oh, but he is indeed," said Mr. Garland, "and he has told Mr. Abel so." "I never heard of such a thing," muttered Kit, looking ruefully at his master and mistress. "I wonder at him, that I do." "You see, Christopher," said Mr. Garland, "this is a point of much importance to you, and you should understand and consider it in that light. This gentleman is able to give you more money than I, not, I hope, to carry through the various relations of master and servant, more kindness and confidence, but certainly, Christopher, to give you more money." "Well," said Kit, "after that, sir—" "Wait a moment," interposed Mr. Garland. "That is not all. You were a very faithful servant to your old employers, as I understand, and should this gentleman recover them, as it is his purpose to attempt doing by every means in his power, I have no doubt that you, being in his service, would meet with your reward. Besides," added the old gentleman with stronger emphasis, "besides having the pleasure of being again brought into communication with those to whom you seem to be very strongly and disinterestedly attached. You must think of all this, Christopher, and not be rash or hasty in your choice." Kit did suffer one twinge, one momentary pang, in keeping the resolution he had already formed, when this last argument passed swiftly into his thoughts, and conjured up the realization of all his hopes and fancies. But it was gone in a minute, and he sturdily rejoined that the gentleman must look out for somebody else, as he did think he might have done at first. "He has no right to think that I'd be led away to go to him, sir," said Kit, turning round again after half a minute's hammering. "Does he think I'm a fool?" "He may, perhaps, Christopher, if you refuse his offer," said Mr. Garland gravely. "Then let him, sir," retorted Kit. "What do I care, sir, what he thinks? Why should I care for his thinking, sir, when I know that I should be a fool, and worse than a fool, sir, to leave the kindest master and mistress that ever was or can be, who took me out of the streets a very poor and hungry lad indeed, poorer and hungrier perhaps than even you think for, sir, to go to him or anybody. If Miss Nell was to come back, ma'am," added Kit, turning suddenly to his mistress, "why, that would be another thing, and perhaps if she wanted me, I might ask you now and then to let me work for her when all was done at home. But when she comes back, I see now that she'll be rich as old master always said she would, and being a rich young lady, what could she want of me? No, no," added Kit, shaking his head sorrowfully, "she'll never want me any more, and bless her, I hope she never may, though I should like to see her too." Here Kit drove a nail into the wall, very hard, much harder than was necessary, and having done so, faced about again. "There's the pony, sir," said Kit. "Whisker, ma'am, and he knows so well I'm talking about him that he begins to neigh directly, sir. Would he let anybody come near him but me, ma'am? Here's the garden, sir, and Mr. Abel, ma'am. Would Mr. Abel part with me, sir? Or is there anybody that could be fonder of the garden, ma'am? It would break mother's heart, sir, and even little Jacob would have sense enough to cry his eyes out, ma'am, if he thought that Mr. Abel could wish to part with me so soon, after having told me, only the other day, that he hoped we might be together for years to come." There is no telling how long Kit might have stood upon the ladder, addressing his master and mistress by turns, and generally turning towards the wrong person, if Barbara had not at that moment come running up to say that a messenger from the office had brought a note, which, with an expression of some surprise at Kit's oratorical appearance, she put into her master's hand. "Oh," said the old gentleman after reading it, "ask the messenger to walk this way." Barbara tripping off to do as she was bid, he turned to Kit and said that they would not pursue the subject any further, and that Kit could not be more unwilling to part with them than they would be to part with Kit, a sentiment which the old lady very generously echoed. "At the same time, Christopher," added Mr. Garland, glancing at the note in his hand, "if the gentleman should want to borrow you now and then for an hour or so, or even a day or so at a time, we must consent to lend you, and you must consent to be lent. Oh, here is the young gentleman. How do you do, sir?" This salutation was addressed to Mr. Chuckster, who, with his hat extremely on one side, and his hair a long way beyond it, came swaggering up the walk. "Hope I see you well, sir," returned that gentleman. "Hope I see you well, ma'am. Charming box this, sir. Delicious country to be sure. You want to take Kit back with you, I find," observed Mr. Garland. "I have got a chariot cab waiting on purpose," replied the clerk. "A very spanking gray in that cab, sir, if you're a judge of horseflesh." Declining to inspect the spanking gray, on the plea that he was but poorly acquainted with such matters, and would but imperfectly appreciate his beauties, Mr. Garland invited Mr. Chuckster to partake of a slight repast in the way of lunch. That gentleman readily consenting, certain cold viands, flanked with ale and wine, were speedily prepared for his refreshment. At this repast, Mr. Chuckster exerted his utmost abilities to enchant his entertainers, and impress them with a conviction of the mental superiority of those who dwelt in town, with which view he led the discourse to the small scandal of the day, in which he was justly considered by his friends to shine prodigiously. Thus, he was in a condition to relate the exact circumstances of the difference between the Marquis of Misler and Lord Bobby, which it appeared originated in a disputed bottle of champagne, and not in a pigeon pie, as erroneously reported in the newspapers. Neither had Lord Bobby said to the Marquis of Misler, "Misler, one of us two tells a lie, and I'm not the man," as incorrectly stated by the same authorities, but, "Misler, you know where I'm to be found, and damn, sir, find me if you want me," which, of course, entirely changed the aspect of this interesting question and placed it in a very different light. He also acquainted them with the precise amount of the income guaranteed by the Duke of Figsbury to Violetta Stetta of the Italian Opera, which it appeared was payable quarterly, and not half-yearly, as the public had been given to understand, and which was exclusive, and not inclusive, as had been monstrously stated, of jewelry, perfumery, hair powder for 5 footmen, and 2 daily changes of kid gloves for a page. Having entreated the old lady and gentleman to set their minds at rest on these absorbing points, for they might rely on his statement being the correct one, Mr. Chuckster entertained them with theatrical chit-chat and the court circular, and so wound up a brilliant and fascinating conversation which he had maintained alone, and without any assistance whatever, for upwards of 3/4 of an hour. "And now that the nag has got his wind again," said Mr. Chuckster, rising in a graceful manner, "I'm afraid I must cut my stick." Neither Mr. nor Mrs. Garland offered any opposition to his tearing himself away, feeling, no doubt, that such a man could ill be spared from his proper sphere of action, and therefore Mr. Chuckster and Kit were shortly afterwards upon their way to town. Kit being perched upon the box of the cabriolet beside the driver, and Mr. Chuckster seated in solitary state inside, with one of his boots sticking out at each of the front windows. When they reached the notary's house, Kit followed into the office and was desired by Mr. Abel to sit down and wait, for the gentleman who wanted him had gone out and perhaps might not return for some time. This anticipation was strictly verified, for Kit had had his dinner and his tea, and had read all the lighter matter in the law list and the post office directory, and had fallen asleep a great many times before the gentleman whom he had seen before came in, which he did at last in a very great hurry. He was closeted with Mr. Witherden for some little time, and Mr. Abel had been called in to assist at the conference before Kit, wondering very much what he was wanted for, was summoned to attend them. "Christopher," said the gentleman, turning to him directly he entered the room, "I have found your old master and young mistress." "No, sir." "Have you, though?" returned Kit, his eyes sparkling with delight. "Where are they, sir? How are they, sir? Are they near here?" "A long way from here," returned the gentleman, shaking his head. "But I am going away tonight to bring them back, and I want you to go with me." "Me, sir?" cried Kit, full of joy and surprise. "The place," said the strange gentleman, turning thoughtfully to the notary, "indicated by this man of the dogs, is how far from here? 60 miles. From 60 to 70. Humph. If we travel post all night, we shall reach there in good time tomorrow morning. Now, the only question is, as they will not know me, and the child, God bless her, would think that any stranger pursuing them had a design upon her grandfather's liberty, can I do better than take this lad, whom they both know and will readily remember, as an assurance to them of my friendly intentions?" "Certainly not," replied the notary. "Take Christopher by all means." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Kit, who had listened to this discourse with a lengthening countenance, "but if that's the reason, I'm afraid I should do more harm than good. Miss Nell, sir, she knows me and would trust in me, I am sure. But old master, I don't know why, gentlemen, nobody does, would not bear me in his sight after he had been ill, and Miss Nell herself told me that I must not go near him or let him see me any more. I should spoil all that you were doing if I went, I'm afraid. I'd give the world to go, but you had better not take me, sir." "Another difficulty," cried the impetuous gentleman. "Was ever man so beset as I? Is there nobody else that knew them, nobody else in whom they had any confidence? Solitary as their lives were, is there no one person who would serve my purpose?" "Is there, Christopher?" said the notary. "Not one, sir," replied Kit. "Yes, though there's my mother." "Did they know her?" said the single gentleman. "Know her, sir? Why, she was always coming backwards and forwards. They were as kind to her as they were to me. Bless you, sir, she expected they'd come back to her house." "Then where the devil is the woman?" said the impatient gentleman, catching up his hat. "Why isn't she here? Why is that woman always out of the way when she is most wanted?" In a word, the single gentleman was bursting out of the office, bent upon laying violent hands on Kit's mother, forcing her into a post-chaise, and carrying her off, when this novel kind of abduction was with some difficulty prevented by the joint efforts of Mr. Abel and the notary, who restrained him by dint of their remonstrances, and persuaded him to sound Kit upon the probability of her being able and willing to undertake such a journey on so short a notice. This occasioned some doubts on the part of Kit, and some violent demonstrations on that of the single gentleman, and a great many soothing speeches on that of the notary and Mr. Abel. The upshot of the business was that Kit, after weighing the matter in his mind and considering it carefully, promised, on behalf of his mother, that she should be ready within 2 hours from that time to undertake the expedition, and engaged to produce her in that place, in all respects equipped and prepared for the journey, before the specified period had expired. Having given this pledge, which was rather a bold one, and not particularly easy of redemption, Kit lost no time in sallying forth, and taking measures for its immediate fulfillment.